Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this inaugural Sinologia Symposium. When Natasha and Nick, who you'll meet shortly, approached us with the idea of putting out a student journal, I was naturally very, very excited. As a recovering academic myself, I found that the work that I do right now puts me in a nice place where I can kind of graze on interesting academic topics and engage week to week with real scholars, but without having to actually commit. It's like having the occasional sort of flight sampler of craft brewed beers or a wine tasting instead of actually going on full blown raging benders and waking up with terrible hangovers. But seriously, I have made it part of my own personal mission to bridge the gap between academia and popular media. And that's why when Anla and SupChina approached us about teaming up with them with the Sinica podcast, it's just been such a terrific place to hang my hat. We were so aligned in terms of our mission, and I was just so happy that they expressed an interest in us. I have really tried over the last 6 years to make it an important part of the show to showcase up-and-coming academic talent in the China field. There are others out there doing the same thing, of course. I think of particular note for China politics and applied history would be Jude Blanchette at CSIS and his Pekingology podcast. But I think the topic for this year's symposium in particular was a really inspired choice. I think an awful lot about history and memory and how they are such potent forces in shaping political behavior. Often I find that here in the United States, our ahistoricism is, well, at once liberating, or sort of frees us from the fetters, from the freight of history, but also profoundly crippling. And it's really, on balance, very worrisome to me. Our inability to understand the place of historical narratives in the worldviews of other nations has really been an Achilles heel, I think, in our foreign policy. Our lack of awareness about the contingency and the fragility of our own values and institutions, the historical processes that actually brought us here. It often gives rise to this kind of hubris of this kind of blithe teleologism, how we believe that history is somehow goal-directed and that we are the end product of it in some deliberate fashion. This Whiggish idea that I think does not serve us well at all anymore. I've had the chance to read all 5 of the papers that have been selected. I should note, did not have any role whatsoever in the selection, but I am really delighted with these picks. And for one reason, one of the scholars who was selected here is actually here in Chapel Hill, my adopted hometown. Another was an intern for the Sinica podcast. But really, I swear to God, I had nothing to do with the picks. I learned an awful lot from all of them. They will make meaningful contributions to our understanding, I think, of China today in the world, as you will hear shortly. So let me first introduce you to the dynamic duo who really made this happen. Natasha Locke is an incoming PhD student at the Lao China Center. At the Lao China Institute of King's College in London. Her work examines the manipulation of historical narratives by autocratic regimes. She holds a degree in history, in international relations, and in Mandarin Chinese from the University of Exeter, and was a Yanjing Scholar at Peking University, where she was awarded Graduate of the Year, and you will see why. So thank you so much, Natasha. Also, part of the team and another SupChina ambassador is Nick Ackert. Nick Ackert is a PhD candidate with the Security Studies program at the MIT Department of Political Science. His research focuses on Chinese foreign policy, East Asian security, and political violence in Southeast Asia. Before joining the MIT community, Nick graduated from Harvard with a concentration in classics. He also earned a double MSc in political science and international history at Peking University and the London School of Economics, LSE. Now, let me hand over to you, Natasha. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kaiser, and welcome to all of you joining today. I'm absolutely delighted to kickstart our SupChina Sinologia Conference with a collection of fascinating and diverse student focuses this morning. This is exactly what Nick and I dreamed of creating. We started Sinologia as a platform to bridge the gap between journalism and academia by connecting the SupChina community with the newest generation of China-focused graduate students that were in political science and applied history. Sinologia represents a practical exchange. Presenters today are given the opportunity to pitch their ideas to a diverse audience of practitioners, whilst attendees get to engage with highly polished, multidisciplinary work that draws from the latest cutting-edge methodological innovations from the academy. Let me hand over to my colleague and friend Nick, who will introduce our keynote speaker for today. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you so much, Natasha, and good morning all. Kaiser, Natasha, and I are delighted to introduce Dr. Chung Lee from the Brookings Institution to deliver some opening remarks. Dr. Lee is the director of Brookings' John L. Thornton China Center and a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program. He is also a director of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Dr. Lee is a scholar of many accolades, so I hope that this brief introduction does him justice. He received a master's in Asian studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and a doctorate in political science from Princeton University. He has since published many books on Chinese development and foreign policy, the most recent of which include Chinese Politics in the Xi Jinping Era, Reassessing Collective Leadership, The Power of Ideas, The Rising Influence of Thinkers and Think Tanks in China, and finally, Middle Class Shanghai, Reshaping US-China Engagement. Dr. Lee, thank you for joining us today. I look forward to your remarks on the state of the field. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Nick, for your generous introduction. First, I would like to applaud SupChina, and especially its wonderful CEO, Anna Chen, for your long-standing, renowned efforts to bridge the gap between journalism and academia, between public policy and scholarly research, and between Wall Street and Main Street. You and your team have been on the front lines in promoting international understanding across the Pacific. I also want to congratulate Kaiser, Natasha, and Nick for organizing this wonderful conference and the 5 paper contributors for your outstanding work. I'm truly honored to join you this morning to exchange views and ideas about the state of American studies of Chinese politics and applied history, especially at this crucial moment in world history, not to mention the uncertain nature of the US-China relationship, the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. The state of American study of China is a huge topic, and I'm not certainly in a position to give an assessment of the field in my 10-minute or 10 to 15 minute long presentation. Instead, I would like to share with you what I believe are the 2 major challenges that the students of Chinese politics and foreign policy in the West, especially in the United States, currently encounter. The first is regarding methodology, and the second relates to ideology. Now, first, methodology. I would like to start with the famous article in Foreign Affairs entitled "The Decline of International Studies," written by Charles King, a political science professor at the Georgetown University. If you haven't looked at that, you please do. This, again, it's published 2015 in Foreign Affairs. The title is "Decline of International Studies." The article explores some fundamental problems in the US studies of international affairs. This is a long list of problems, include the increasing inward looking of American society, lack of government and private funding for foreign studies, and academic own drift away from knowing real things about the real places. This is the real things and real places is from that article. It's a quote. Now, the article particularly highlights the fact that the most foreign language programs in American schools, whether high schools or universities, have experienced double-digit losses in the past decade. Even Spanish, a language chosen by more American students than all other languages combined, has also declined. Today, the third most studied language in US higher education, behind Spanish and French. People will think probably it's Chinese. No, it's not Chinese, but American Sign Language. So this tells you really into foreign language studies is really far from adequate to deal with the rapidly changing world. The article has a very sharp and insightful line. I just want to quote here. It says, young Americans can play video games with their peers in Cairo and chat online with friends in St. Petersburg and download the music from a punk band base in Beijing, maybe Kaiser, your band at that time, But consuming the word is not the same as understanding it. That's end of quote. Now, such a trend is further accelerated by the telecommunication revolution and the perpetuating impact of social media. Now, this is, in my view, exactly, what the futurist John Nisbet, he actually feared. I think that I recall that this is something I read almost 30 years ago. He said, I quote, "We are joining in information, but starve for knowledge." Now, but this also leads to another equally prevalent and very problematic trend in graduate studies in social sciences in American universities, which is the dominance of quantitative modeling. Now, I'm not biased against quantitative modeling. I think that we do need to have this kind of more scientific approach, particularly that's a tradition of American social science research. But to me, it seemed to be become increasingly excessive, really eliminated many other legitimate fields. So in other words, I always say the field economics sounds like the same as mathematics, and the discipline of political science turns into like statistics. This does not serve American interest, in my view. We may forget that politics is more an art than a science. My mentor at Princeton, Professor Lin White, I collaborated with many articles with him. I remember that when he said, very pointedly, he said, sadly, American academics may need to encounter more countries like North Korea to realize politics in international affairs cannot be explained only by quantitative modeling. So the politics is very much real with a nuclear power such as North Korea. Now, we need to study culture, history, society, individual leaders, and many other things in a given country, not just the quantitative modeling. Now, let me move to the second challenge, ideology, with more focus on China and US-China relations. As we all know, the US-China relationship, the world's most consequential bilateral relationship, has deteriorated at a speed and scope beyond what could have been predicted. Not only has each side accused the other of being a genocidal regime and speculate that the COVID-19 pandemic originated from a lab leak in the other country. If you look at the US media and look at the Chinese media, still that the accusation, that the speculation or accusation still has some room, has some market. But also the risk for military confrontation and the war over Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, between two superpowers is on the rise. More recently, US Congress has been reviewing and will likely pass the so-called Assessing Xi Jinping's Assessing Xi's Interference and Supervision Act. The abbreviation is AXIS Act. So think of George W. Bush's axis of evil or our opponents in World War II, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, Biden's recent visit to East Asia and also echo the newly adopted new Indo-Pacific strategy, and also seems like that we want to build NATO in Asia. At least this is what the Chinese perceive. Now, all of these incidents I just described show us how deteriorated and how dangerous the bilateral relationship is now. Russia's horrific invasion of Ukraine and the unprecedentedly strong reaction by the international community, of course, has some justification, not only mark the complete collapse of the post-World War II international order, but could also lead to the end of economic globalization. Now, it would be naive to believe that the Russia-Ukraine war is the last war to reshape the international order, or to think that this sort of bloody war will be limited to continental Europe. Now, this ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis and the potential secondary sanction against China, if China does not fully comply with the US, and the NATO-led economic sanctions against Russia could push China increasingly closer to Russia. Now, this reminds me the warning because I taught a course at Hamilton College when I was a professor there for 15 years. I remember that I used this textbook by Dr. Brzezinski, former National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter. Actually, this book was published 25 years ago in 1997. In his classic called the Grand Chess Book, Brzezinski wrote, I quote, potentially, the most dangerous scenario would be a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran, an anti-hegemonic coalition. The anti-hegemonic is quote unquote coalition, united not by an ideology, but by complementary grievances. It would be reminiscent in scale and scope of the challenges once posed by Sino-Soviet bloc, though this time, China will likely be the leader and Russia the follower. Averting this contingency, however remote it may be, will require a display of US geostrategic skill on the western, eastern, and southern perimeters of Eurasia simultaneously, end quote. Now, I feel that we are in a strategic deadlock facing what Brzezinski called the most dangerous scenario. Really, this visionary, strategy thinker so foresightedly predicted 25 years ago. Again, it's 25 years ago. Now, it will likely crystallize an already threatened bifurcation or polarization of the world, resulting into confrontational blocks in 10 key areas. I recently gave some talks in Canada, in Italy, in Greece, and I also will give similar remarks in Asia just in 2 weeks. Now, I think it is 10 key domains or 10 key areas we will see that can evidence this polarization or bifurcation. It's very, very disturbing. Some of them have already emerged and will be intensified, and some may take time to reach full-fledged decoupling, but will likely accelerate. Now, let me mention these 10 areas that will divide our world very quickly, because I don't have time to elaborate on each of them. Number one is a two trade and investment systems. Number two, two industry chains and two supply chains. Number three, two oil and natural gas supply channels. Number four, two credit card payment system. Number five, two financial and currency systems. Number six, two IT, 5G, and internet systems. Number seven, two satellite navigation system. Number eight, two outer space exploration programs. Number nine, two military and ideological blocks, which simply is a new Cold War. And finally, number 10, a possible hot war in the digital era. We should be clear-minded that there is no guarantee that this will just be another Cold War. It will potentially instead be a hot war in the digital era. Now, this dark scenario may or may not happen. Also, sadly, I believe that the world in which we live should be a multipolar world with the great powers of the United States, China, India, Russia, EU, ASEAN countries, and the growing importance of Africa and South America. And we certainly should not forget the Middle East. Neither the unipolar nor bipolar structure serves the interests of the international community. But dangerously, Russia's horrific invasion of Ukraine and the rhetoric about democracy versus dictatorship will push the world into bipolarity. Now, to conclude, we should ask ourselves whether we can live with a growing, divided, or bifurcated world. And if not, what should we do to prevent that from worsening, and more importantly, maximize the chance for maintaining precious peace in this perplexing time? Let me end by, again, congratulating those paper authors who are, in my view, have not fallen into the methodological and ideological traps that I have just described. That gives me a great hope. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Li. And I couldn't agree with you more about what you've said about painting the stark scenario and the ways to avoid it, the importance of international studies, of touching multiple parts of the elephant and using different sets of lenses to look at China, including the lens of the humanities. It's very important. And I also agree with you that the authors of these 5 papers have not fallen into the methodological or ideological traps that you've laid out. And I'm very glad to see that. And I think that's part of the reason why these in particular were selected. Let me just quickly, well, thank you very much. And let me comment quickly on the state of how this will work. Each presenter will have 15 minutes to introduce the core ideas of their paper, the work that they're doing. And that will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A period. At the end of their presentations, I think that Natasha and Nick and perhaps myself will offer a couple of comments to get discussion started, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Audience members should submit their questions either by the chat function or the Q&A function. I'll try to keep an eye on both. And then I'll pick some of the ones that I think were particularly well put and read some of those questions out. Please try to keep those questions brief. And then we're going to have a little short break after the first set of 3 presenters. Please try to keep it to 15 minutes. All right, let's get going. Who is up first? I don't actually know. Let me look very quickly. Ah, yes. Number 1 is Emma Shleifer, whose paper is called "Never Again: National Memory Narratives in Xi and Netanyahu's Foreign Policies." Over to you, Emma.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen and hopefully that should work. Okay, great. Hi, so I'm Emma, as I mentioned, from Johns Hopkins and Peking University, similar to Natasha, also a former re-entering scholar. And today I'm presenting on research that was done between 2017 and 2020 on the national memory narratives and their uses specifically in foreign policies of China and Israel, specifically under Xi and Netanyahu. So just briefly to place the national memory narratives in the literature. So there's a lot of in the literature on collective memory, on national memory, and how these are disseminated primarily through education and how they come about as well. But while there's a lot on why these narratives emerge, how they're transformed and how they persist, there's very little that looks at not only how they're shaped by the state, but also how they shape policy decisions and how they can be also shaped by policy decisions. So this research was really in this lens of trying to understand specifically for China, how national memory narratives formulated by the state specifically can be used to achieve foreign policy objectives. So why is this research important and why now? So there are two key factors to look at into, and really what was inspired by it is that, going as far back as Thucydides, in in Athens and Sparta, etc., there was he mentions that there should be emphasis on security, self-interest, but also honor in understanding motives for war. And while there's been a lot of focus on security and self-interest, there's been less emphasis on honor, and memory is a key component of that, and I believe also is its own important element in understanding state behavior. And separately, going into the case studies as well, and I'll explain a little bit why I chose these case studies, there's also a dearth of China analysts in Israel, and to some extent vice versa as well, even though there's a growing relationship between China and Israel, and that the exploration of their relationship has mostly been contained to military relations, and so requires a deeper understanding if their relationship is to progress in a healthy way as well. So the research aims to answer two questions. One is, which national memory narratives are used? And like I mentioned, national memory narratives is a term that I use to differentiate from collective memory and national memory, because collective memory require a degree of belief by the people, which is pretty difficult to measure empirically, and doesn't tell us much about how the narratives are used for policies, but also different from national memory, which is simply imposed by dictated by the state, and doesn't need to be believed, but also doesn't speak much to the policy side of things. So first of all, understanding which national memory narratives are used. And the second, the meat of this research is really, what policy purpose do these memory narratives serve? And so to explore that question, I use a four-part methodology, first using case studies, because this research is pretty emergent and embryonic, and so it requires very detailed analysis of specific speeches and transcripts, and really looking into their context. Also because you can't really use a data-only approach, because national memory narratives are as much about what states don't say as what they do say. So really important to contextualize qualitatively what you get from the data. So I use Israel and China because it might surprise you, but they are fairly similar in the sense of they were both born in war in 1948, 1949, so in very similar periods, had to essentially restart their national memory narratives from scratch as new nations, and also share fairly similar emphasis on using narratives for policy purposes. And lastly, as I mentioned, have a growing relationship that requires further understanding beyond military confinements. And then, of course, using data measures like keyword extraction, but also semi-structured interviews and informal discussions. So there are two narratives that emerge from this research and from the literature using collective memory and national memory, one of which is narratives of an ancient past, and the other will be narratives of a victim-oriented narrative that we'll look at a little bit later. So the narratives of an ancient past for Israel specifically are more based on a narrative related to Judaism and biblical history stories, and for China, more on dynastic times, beginning with Qin Shi Huangdi. The narratives share a similar theme, and they do both promote national unity, but their uses are fundamentally different. So while Israel uses this narrative for territorial claims, China actually has found it hard to use this for territorial claims, and instead uses it more for domestic enthusiasm for rejuvenation policies. Briefly, there are two ways that Israel uses this narrative of an ancient past. First, beginning in the early 1960s for unity purposes. So in the 1960s, it was facing social tensions and mounting unrest as well because of influxing Jewish communities from across the world, including Ashkenazis from Eastern Europe, Sephardic from North Africa, but also from other parts of geographic parts. And so one common thread that could be made to cut through, because it didn't necessarily exist there in the first place, could be made to cut through these differences of language, of religion even, because not all Jewish communities practice the same way and to the same extent, and even cultural barriers, was to find a common ground through a cultural interpretation of Judaism. And the fact that it was very difficult to create a master narrative of primarily Ashkenazi experiences of a cultural Judaism points to the fact that this was a very important step for the state to take, and it was a very conscious one to take as well. And I'm happy to go into a little more details in the Q&A. The second use of this narrative that is much more explicit and unprecedented in Netanyahu specifically is Netanyahu's rhetoric is used for land claims, and so there are explicit and frequent biblical references. Surprisingly so, for example, 43% of the speeches that I analyzed mention King David specifically in relation specifically to Jerusalem, for example, and that is pretty unprecedented in terms of Netanyahu specifically. And these are especially salient in international speeches to the UN or the EU and other international community organizations. And it's very pointed, I think, to see that the number of times that the word Jew, separate from Jewish state, for example, appears in 32 documents surveyed is over 100 times. And that is, contextualized carefully for making sure that it does reflect, redirect to these biblical claims and narratives of the past. So pretty strong narrative there, and pretty strongly pushed by Netanyahu specifically. Secondly, really regarding China rarely uses it for territorial claims, uses the ancient narrative past for territorial claims, and focuses it primarily on glory and grandeur, and uses it for, therefore, unity and national rejuvenation policy. So we see a similar theme with Israel in the sense that there is unity behind this, unity purpose behind this narrative, but in a more practical sense, it's really about the national rejuvenation policies, including military budget spending, R&D research as well. So there's really a strong sense of this narrative throughout. And in contrast to Israel, there's a more important emphasis placed on physical sites. More than 1,200 have been added since the patriotic education campaign in the 1990s, in large part because of this campaign. And some examples include the Terracotta Warrior Museums, Yuan, Shaolin Temple, etc. And most of these were rehabilitated in the 1990s to redirect from the late 1980s social unrest as well. So as I'll mention a little later, also a rising theme is the social unrest leading to a redirection of the narrative. So then moving on to the findings for narratives of victimhood specifically, this is the second broad narrative, national memory narrative. And there are three main findings or observations that can be made from Israel and China. First is that Israel, the most important one, Israel centers on the Holocaust primarily, and especially an Ashkenazi interpretation of that. And secondly, China centers on the century of humiliation. And they both use these national memory narratives for similar foreign policy objectives, but they use them in fairly different ways. So first of them is to alleviate foreign policy crises, and narratives are emphasized when they're shared in a similar way and de-escalated when they're shared in contradictory ways and with potential foes. And secondly, they're used for state legitimization. And I'm happy to go into a little more details in the Q&A, but there's an important difference, however, in how these narratives are used for legitimacy. In Israel, this is used primarily for external legitimacy of the state, and in China, it is used primarily for the internal legitimization of the party. And this also leads into further research questions as to whether state and regime types can lead to different needs for narratives and vice versa. Oh, apologies. In terms of Israel, the narratives of victimhood are used in two ways. One is to justify the existence of the state by referring to the Holocaust as an evidence for a nation's eternal hate against the Jewish people, as Netanyahu references explicitly several times throughout his presidency. As his prime ministerial position, this creates a justification for Israel to exist and an eternal justification as well. The second use is really and this is the more salient use of this narrative, is to justify the use of force. And building military strength is a key lesson that was derived from the 1940s, because the Holocaust is deemed as the result of, or partly the result of, in Netanyahu's narrative, as the Jewish diaspora being unarmed and unprepared. And so evidently the logic is that therefore Israel should be armed and prepared. This is a relatively recent development in the 1980s, because as we'll see with China, it was before a victor-oriented narrative, and actually the victim narrative was considered pretty shameful. In terms of China, there's a similar use of this narrative for legitimacy, but internally. And this is done by linking the rejuvenation of China, and specifically the bringing China out from the century accumulation to the Communist Party directly, rather than the birth of the communist state in 1949. And again, happy to go into more details later, but this is a very salient point, is that party loyalty and party justification is is prioritized in this narrative. The second salient use of this narrative is actually the absence of this narrative used to justify territorial claims, in stark contrast to Israel. Alternative to the victim-oriented narrative, China uses more of a narrative of long-term unification and unity in order to ensure that its claim on territories is staked. And this is much more pronounced in areas with greater insecurity for China and greater likelihood for conflict with external parties. So for example, in Taiwan, actually the PRC emphasizes unity at the expense of the communist narrative, glossing over, very interestingly in conversations this came up, glossing over the divisions in the 1920s and later, and really emphasizing the nationalists' participation against the Japanese invasion. Overall, China and Israel use victimhood narratives the most, victim-oriented one the most. But very interestingly, in what came up in the findings, is that they reassert land-oriented national memory narratives when in an insecure political or military situation. There are three further observations that were made here. Is first, that crisis of government, particularly the trust in government from a social context, spur the overhaul of national memory narratives in completely different directions. For Israel and China, this resulted in an overhaul of the victor narrative that was essential for example, in Israel for military conscription, to the complete opposite, which was a victim-oriented narrative. So both indicated transformation of their narratives pretty fundamentally when governments experience threats of domestic instability and crisis of trust. Second, a state is less likely to invoke a narrative that will foster antagonism with a to-be foe. This was evident, for example, for Israel in regard to its stance with Hungary and Poland, for example, recently. But overall, invoking narratives in the international arena really depends on building or stabilizing ties. And finally, as I mentioned a little earlier, politically tense climates can lead to increased use of land-oriented memory narratives. And this can be, for China, a unification narrative that is pushed, and for Israel, a biblical land claims that is pushed. And finally, interestingly, for China, the victim narratives, as I mentioned earlier, hinders its use of force abroad because it draws from its victim-oriented narrative of the century of humiliation principles of respect for state sovereignty, and therefore this precludes its easier use of force abroad. In terms of further research, there are three key questions I think that emerged and that this research lays the basis for. First of all, do narratives survive leadership changes? Netanyahu, as we'll all know, is no longer in current power. And so have the narratives changed there? Secondly, are national memory narratives effective to achieve foreign policy goals? This was merely a question of which policy goals they serve to achieve and not whether they were effective in achieving those. And finally, can specific crises lead to specific national memory narratives? Because so far there's only a model of that crisis can lead to changes in national narratives, but no mention of whether there can be more granularity on their direction. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Emma. And it was really enjoyable and really interesting. And you've anticipated some, at least, of the questions that I initially had in your list of questions for further research. To be honest, you've had me at the epigraph, at the opening quotation that starts your paper by Ernst Renan. Shared suffering unites more than joy, which I think is absolutely true and was a very appropriate one. You've made a really great case, I think, for the parallels between the way that the Israeli and Chinese states have used national memory narratives. I think you pointed out some important differences too. So what I'm really interested in, though, is hearing your thoughts on what we should do with the knowledge when we, as a state actor, when we understand the way that other states deploy national memory narratives. What do we do with that information? Does it help us to glean sort of a keener understanding of intention? Do we understand what states intend to do when they start rolling out these national memory narratives? For example, I was commenting the other day how you can look at China when it starts putting out popular feature films about the American Volunteer Corps, the aviators called the Flying Tigers. We know that signals generally a warming with the U.S. when there's a spate of Korean War films. Quite the opposite. So what do we do with that? That's a great question. We also have some great questions from the audience, and there's one in particular that I do want to share, but let's hear your thoughts on that first.
Sure. Thank you very much for that question. And I think that's a key question, because I did want this research to be practical to some extent. And I do think that there's a large application to foreign policy, although it may be, less evident at first than if it was, focused on military or security, as this has been done before. But I think there are two key things that can be gleaned from this this exploration of narratives in foreign policy. First is that pretty importantly is that the state puts out national memory narratives directions and is keen for certain directions to be taken in the memory narratives, but ultimately they resonate within their population and they can go beyond what the state expects. And I think that they can back the state into a corner. And I think that's been seen to some extent in China with this, the nationalism that these narratives have pushed and have fostered and encouraged to some extent. And so I think that it can give important information to the state as to how to be careful with them and really understanding what the impacts of these narratives may be when it goes beyond their reach. So that's the first for policy use that I see. And then the second one is really to understand, bringing back the emotional element within the Thucydides triad, with military and security and economic considerations. There should be consideration of a state's emotional state to some extent, and I think memory is a big part of that. And memory creation is not necessarily emotional in the traditional sense of the term, but it can through public opinion, through a rhetoric of the state, really push the state towards certain actions, towards certain behaviors, towards certain attitudes that can either be promoted or really have been against the will of the state in a sense, similar to the first point. So I think understanding where the national memory narratives are and what the state is trying to achieve with them is really beneficial is really useful to understand really where kind of a state, a state's foreign policy temperature is in terms of its current, but also more importantly its future directions and behaviors.
That's very, very good. Excellent. Just one observation is that I think that the durability and the persuasiveness, the effectiveness of national memory narratives is to some extent tied to their actual validity, to the extent to which they really do represent truth. However, subjective they are, I think to some extent, when they're utterly far-fetched, mythology about, Kim Il-sung or whatever, they don't have the persuasive power that something like, the century of humiliation narrative that China has and uses often has. And I mean, I look at how that has endured. We should remember, as Rana Mitter reminds us, that Chiang Kai-shek wrote "Avenge National Humiliation" in his diary every single day, right? So, I mean, this has, it's not just something that Xi Jinping or even his immediate predecessors had drummed up. We have a great question from Sinyi from the audience. He or she asks, I'm wondering, have you looked into how national memories in both cases were produced and crystallized? Who were the main actors and institutions in producing the particular version of national memory in both cases? That's a big question, but it's a great question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Shani, for the time. That's a fantastic question. And it's true that in this research, I don't go into depth in it, mostly for the sake of conciseness. But that's really a key question. And I think it's very difficult to pinpoint, exactly which actors sometimes are behind national memory narratives. But it is clear, for example, in the case of China, that Xi Jinping was very adamant in linking on the basis of some truth, as you mentioned earlier, but linking the party for example, to the rejuvenation narrative and the century of humiliation narrative. And if you go, for example, so one of his first visits as president and as a member was actually to go to key sites of the century of humiliation and rejuvenation and the narratives that it promotes. And when you go to the museum, for example, in Shanghai in the First Party Congress, for example, there's a very strong narrative behind that. So I think it's hard to pinpoint specific actors, but it would definitely be a question for further research. I think that would be fantastic to look into. But I think it's at least for Netanyahu in terms of the biblical, the emotive biblical language claims and language, and for Xi in terms of the rejuvenation narrative through a century of humiliation. Those two were pretty clearly led by the leaders. But then, of course, yeah, it would be really interesting to see who actually implements it and whether there have been some debates as well as to how to implement it.
Great. Natasha, I believe you have some observations and some questions for Emma on her paper.
Yeah, Emma, absolutely fantastic paper. Really enjoyed it and your presentation today. I think the structure is so clear here in that you're answering which narratives are used and for what purpose are they being used. Would certainly love to read a book on this topic one day. With regards to your methodology as well, I think you made a great note that what isn't publicly said is just as interesting as what is said sometimes, and therefore a backup to the qualitative data needs to be this kind of strong analysis. And again, a very refreshing comparative study here. I think you don't often see Israel and China clumped together in this kind of study, so definitely a more unique one. A question that came up just in, giving this a comparative study is, would you say one of the narratives is more sustainable than the other? So that is, China's is more sustainable than Israel's, or vice versa?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for your feedback and also that question. And that's something that definitely came up and why I included, our national memory narratives, do they survive leadership changes? We can't tell for Xi yet, I think, but for Netanyahu, that's something that could definitely be explored as he's currently out of office. And that would be definitely something that I think should be explored a little bit further. But in terms of sustainability and which one is more sustainable in the state of the research that I did, I think those that are less tied to emotive language specifically from leaders. So for example, I have in mind Netanyahu's, it's his emotive language of the biblical claims is unprecedented. There was the biblical narrative throughout the existence of Israel, just out of the sheer nature of how that came about and the necessity of it. But the degree to which he took it is pretty unprecedented. So I would be cautious in saying that would be the most sustainable one. And actually, I would argue out of the four essentially that I outlined, I think that would be the least sustainable one. And for China, I think the most sustainable one is really its narrative of unity and unification, that it draws both from its ancient past narrative, and also to some extent its victim-oriented narrative for internal purposes. And then for external purposes, I think its strongest narrative is really, and the most sustainable one is really its victim-oriented narrative, specifically for century of humiliation, because that's where it draws a lot of its, that's how it connects emotionally, and I'll put that in quotes, with foreign actors, specifically, similar states that have experienced perhaps similar pasts, and that's how it creates this connection. And I think that would survive leadership change. So, in terms of sustainability, I think really understanding it is more of whether it provides benefits rather than obviously disadvantages for the states, but also whether it would be able to survive these changes in leadership.
Fantastic, thank you so much.
Do we have time for one more question? Because there's a really good one that I would like to put.
Let's sneak in one more, yeah.
Yeah, I think we can do that. So Adam Bubinich asks, how does the global guilt surrounding the Holocaust change the response of international actors to Israel's NMN in comparison to China's NMN? I know that China's NMN is mainly internal, but I'm still curious to know your thoughts. Fantastic presentation, he says.
Thank you. So if I understand the question correctly, it's to what extent is the global guilt, if that's correct, right, regarding the Holocaust affecting as well Israel's memory narrative. And I think it definitely affected, but I would argue that it doesn't affect it necessarily in the way that we would think, in the sense that it doesn't necessarily actually emphasize it, and actually it can lead it to some extent to backfire. Whether that should be the case or not, I think is a separate question, but I would argue that it can lead it to backfire. And why I say this is can be gleaned, for example, from one example. I think I mentioned very briefly in the presentation how there was some backlash in Israel domestically for Netanyahu's stance on Hungary and Poland. And that was actually a pretty salient case of the narrative being consciously not used because of this global, you could argue, this global guilt of surrounding it. And the context was this, is that very recently, Hungary, for example, made some retractive policies, let's say, on Holocaust memory, denying to some extent the history and effacing some of the history and responsibility as well of its leaders at the time. And Netanyahu came out saying, actually de-emphasized this narrative very strongly, in very stark contrast as well to his other speeches that at the time. And he de-emphasized it, but also actually praised Hungary for its work on its Holocaust memory and commemoration policies. This led to the president of Israel coming out very strongly against Netanyahu. This led to some public domestic backlash as well, in saying that, and actually Yad Vashem and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum also rejected these narratives as historically inaccurate. But it was a clear case, I think, of a state leader being conscious that this specific narrative could backfire when pushed in certain contexts. Whether that is right is, again, another question, but I think it does have a role to play, but more in de-emphasizing and making it less potent in what it could try to achieve for its foreign policy.
Thank you so much. And your presentation, Emma, was just so really on the mark with this history and memory theme for the conference. Next up is Donald Santacaterina, who's going to be talking about the mass line, the role of correspondent journalism in building a socialist China, 1949 to 1956. All right, Donald, take it away.
Thanks, Kaiser, and thank you for Natasha and Nick for organizing. Thanks for Emma kicking everything off there. One of the questions was about what sort of institutions maintain these national memory narratives. And so I'm going to be talking a bit about newspaper culture in socialist China, just something that came up as a parallel there. So today I'm going to be discussing sort of two things: the mass line, this theoretical underpinning of a system of news production that was sort of came to popularity in early years of the PRC from 1949 to 1956. I'm going to be looking at correspondents, Tongxunyuan, who are amateur letter writers that were sort of ad hoc, maybe paid, sometimes unpaid employees of newspaper bureaus who were tasked with sending in manuscripts from their own local work units to talk about life in the PRC. So I'm going to talk about correspondent culture, but before I do that, I want to lay out a few questions that sort of animated my research. First of all, I sort of point out here that we need to think about this question as, assuming, first of all, that many individuals in the PRC were and are convinced of the legitimacy of state-run news, which I contend. I think we need to ask the question seriously of why individuals, everyday consumers, may have been convinced of the legitimacy of this occasionally unbelievable state-produced news content, both in the past and today. So today I'm going to be taking that, question seriously. This is also animated or framed by a larger understanding of Chinese media systems under high socialism, as treated in historical literature and today as these top-down, censored, monolithic enterprises. Often studies look at the People's Daily as sort of taking news information, shoving it into the minds of local consumers. But I ask, is that really the most convincing factor attributing to their success, contributing to individuals believing in the legitimacy of state-produced news? So, picture this imagery for a minute. This is popular, sort of both state-endorsed propaganda and understood in the cultural West as the way news systems in China work. You have the Renmin Ribao in charge of the whole deal. Local newspapers simply reprint material at the everyday level. A newspaper reader or individuals consume that material wholesale. It's censored, it's monolithic, one party line. That's the standard narrative about news and media in socialist China, especially in this early PRC period. I instead choose to study local newspaper culture, not that Renmin Ribao. So I was lucky enough to get a few grants that digitized. I study Anhui province. So here are a few of the newspapers that I look at in Anhui province, the Anqingbao, Huainan Ribao, Wuhubao, small market municipal newspapers. And I look at these to try to see whether this whole narrative adds up. Are these newspapers really just reprinting material wholesale from the People's Daily? And I find that's not quite the case. I also, I'm talking about correspondent journalism. So I'm talking about local amateur news writers in the PRC to get at the everyday life of these individuals. I was also lucky enough when I was last in China to scoop up a few booklets that discuss correspondent journalism. These are from the Zhejiang Ribao. They are, so you have a municipal newspaper who gives out a circular, an internal circular to their news correspondents, telling them about, we should write about drought prevention work. You should use this sort of language when you produce the news. You need to come into contact with the masses more closely, etc. So these are the sources that I'm using to write about correspondent journalism. Okay, before I talk about the correspondents themselves, I think it's really important to talk about the theory underpinning this entire news production system. So I was really pleased when Aminda Smith published some work on the mass line not too recently. If you haven't seen the journal Positions Asia Critique, it's very recent, November 2021, but she wrote about the mass line as a method of knowledge production. So she writes that the mass line was more than just a leadership method. This idea of going to the masses, talking with the masses, and producing policy based off of local opinions was a theory of knowledge production. She contends that the mass line was not an attempt to instill foreign ideas into the minds of the masses. It is not the People's Daily simply shoving ideas about American imperialism into the minds of the masses. Instead, the goal was to elicit voluntary and informed support. I'm going to talk about that voluntary and informed support today through the lens of these amateur correspondent writers. And I agree with Aminda Smith when she argues that recapturing that epistemological element is essential to making sense of these sources. So I don't want to look at correspondence as loyal, brainwashed party individuals just producing verbatim news that the party wants. I want to look at it as if they are voluntary, genuine supporters of local communist policy, national narratives of memory, for example, etc. So let's now look at those actual correspondents. As I said, known as Tongshenyuan, within the newspaper bureau infrastructure, they were delineated from journalists, right? So articles in these local newspapers would say, they would say, this one's by a journalist. Other articles would be noted as, this one is by a local correspondent, Tongshenyuan. So they were delineated as different from journalists, seen more as members of the masses than as employees of a local newspaper unit. They were not authorized to travel from place to place like a journalist would. They were supposed to instead write about their own life, leaders and work units in their everyday understanding of the world. I'll talk about their experiences a little bit more down the road. Okay, so what did public participation in this local news discourse actually look like? Well, first of all, thinking of that mass line narrative, I want to emphasize that the party consistently, and these local newspaper bureaus used public participation as a claim to truth value. They said these articles, what we're writing about is true because we've had the participation of the masses. So for example, here's a local news article from the Wuhubao in 1957 saying, we've had discussions with students, teachers, heads of household. They've sent us letters about their experiences of this question of whether or not participating in Shanchang Laodong is embarrassing. We've had discussions with these individuals. We're putting together a news article with their input. Public participation was a claim to truth value during this high socialist period. What did those correspondents, what did their actual content look like? Well, they appeared to be eager, enthusiastic participants within the socialist system. Of course they were, right? Many of these individuals, who picked up a pen and decided to write to their local newspaper bureau. In some cases, they were complaining about corrupt cadres, about local policy that wasn't quite working out. But in most cases, they were enthusiastic supporters of the party. They spoke the language of the party, of course. This was part of their learning experience of what it meant to be a socialist citizen. For example, here on the right, balance, there were mixed opinions within what they published. There was discussion of, on the one hand, criticizing individuals who weren't keeping up with party policy or local work schedules as they should, but also, we should read these materials for nuance. The idea that, saying the peasants don't have enough time to complete drought prevention work, for example, comes up in this article, defending local individuals for maybe not fitting in line with party policy. I don't have enough time to really get into the details of all this content, but what I want to emphasize is we cannot possibly boil down the diversity of their experiences and their opinions to, they were loyal to the party or they were not. I think that dichotomy is a false one. It doesn't really tell us about what really matters at the heart of this correspondence system. Looking at this system from the perspective of the party, scale was important. Here are some figures to give you a sense of what the scale of correspondent groups look like at national, regional, municipal, and county levels. It's very hodgepodge. It's difficult to find statistics on this. I've tried to get into local newspaper archives last time I was in China, which seems so long ago, but to no avail as of yet. So I have to use sort of hodgepodge statistics published publicly. We get the idea that, in 1950, the Romny Ruba had somewhere around 8,000 registered correspondents. A regional provincial newspaper in Jiangnan received somewhere around 250,000 manuscripts from correspondents in 1951. Municipal Lanzhou Rubao maintained by 1958, with the increase in numbers over time, had at that point around 6,000 registered correspondents. The Dongtai Bao, which is a very small county in Dongtai, Jiangsu province, had around 500 to 600 regular correspondents. So I want to emphasize the scale of these networks, right? They really did want to elicit public participation, especially in narrative, saying we have the masses participating in newspaper production. In addition, we have the correspondent networks and we have the scale of these participants. But there was a fantasy that went along with this, this idea of what the role of the correspondent networks was. You can't see it here, but this is an article underneath the screen share. It's from 1954, published in the Romny Rubal about Pravda in the Soviet Union. So they're fantasizing about Pravda and saying, the broad masses of people's understanding of newspapers has been raised in the Soviet Union so that they truly regard the party newspaper as their own newspaper. It's no longer necessary for Pravda to advocate for this correspondent movement, right? It's over. They've convinced the masses that this is a mass line newspaper, a newspaper of the people. So this fantasy went alongside production of news in the socialist era. What did correspondent experiences actually look like at the local level? I really wanted to get at this too. If you were one of those correspondents writing to a local newspaper, what did you feel? What did you understand? I looked at memoirs and blogs of individuals who participated as correspondents in local newspapers from this earlier eras. These narratives are, of course, limited in the sense that many of these individuals are looking back fondly on their experience. Individuals like Duan Cunzhang was later employed by the People's Daily in 1964. So he obviously found success in the system. So we should look at the limits of these narratives, but let's also look genuinely at what his experience was, right? He writes to the Shanxi Daily in 1954, and he's afraid his level of culture, his Wanhua shaping, is too low, and he can't reflect properly on events. He doesn't know what it takes to become a newspaper correspondent. So he writes off to his local newspaper and he says, what do I need to do? He's a poor peasant at this time. He feels like he doesn't have a good enough grip on characters to write news drafts. But somebody from the newspaper bureau reaches back out to him and says, you can write to us with news article drafts, communication reports, letters to the editor. They don't have to follow any structure, but they must absolutely be truthful. Duan is excited, obviously, by this prospect, and he thinks to himself in these memoirs, unexpectedly, a big editor who lives in the provincial capital still saw me, this rural local farmer, and encouraged me to see that to be a correspondent is just to pick up a pen and write. So I have other narratives, throughout my article, but what I'm emphasizing here is that individuals who engage with this system would have been excited they would have felt like they belonged to this system. They would have felt encouraged to write news that aligned with party goals because of the prospects of what it was like to see an editor from a provincial capital saying to him, a rural farmer, you are worthy, you can write news. Like I said, I have other examples. Liu Xinhua is another one from the Dazhang Ribao. You can see her, proudly showing off her medals here in blogs published well after the fact, reminiscing on what it was like to be a correspondent. Similar narratives going on there. The real question that I'll finish up with what it looks like in the contemporary period with my last minute. But the real question, which I'm not able to fully answer here, I only have anecdotal evidence, but is it effective in actually convincing consumers that these socialist newspapers are genuine reflections of public opinion? Of course, that's a mixed bag, right? Anybody who's been to China or who interacts with individuals who consume Chinese state news know that these are effective narratives in some cases. These narratives that any given narrative, whether it's a national memory narrative or ideas of accusations of COVID starting at military bases in the US, what have you, it doesn't really matter. But we can see that generally individuals in the People's Republic of China, both in the past, participating in that socialist revolutionary project, and today do in some cases consider newspapers genuine reflections of public opinion. What does the correspondent practice look like today? How has it evolved today? Well, kind of in line with that fantasy about Pravda, correspondence, this practice of maintaining and grooming newspaper correspondence seems to have died out. The mass line as embodied by correspondent work is still used to frame some language of, for example, the All China Journalists Association. But I point to things like this. The Renmin Ribao's message board, public message board, Linggao Liu Xinban. These message boards, which allow for public participation. The People's Daily says, post your complaints about local government, about local society, and we will get those messages to local leaders and lead to better policy decisions. These message boards are, I argue, a modern day iteration of older correspondent systems, claims to truth value through public participation in news systems. Questions are welcome. I will stop there and thank you all for your time.
Donald, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. And really, really impressive work and fascinating. I really like the way that you framed it up with those opening questions. I am, of course, interested primarily in what you touched on last, the parallels that you see with today, with the CPC now and how it's maybe retooled for the digital age. Because the idea of the mass line, it hasn't really been relegated to the margins. It isn't dead. It's in fact been revived and given a new lease on life, and it's becoming a load-bearing wall of the party's claims to be in some sense democratic, in that it still represents popular will. But of course, in this age of really effective sentiment analysis software, the sentiment analysis software that draws on oceanic volumes of data, and of course on not just the messaging boards that are specifically aimed at leaders, not just the little red app, but also on all that social media stuff that they're able to process and able to, sort of tweeze out what people are saying. So they're very much concerned about this still. And this network of what's called 自媒体, these bloggers, essentially people who are posting constantly on Weixin or on Weibo. These are, maybe the local amateur news writers in their modern iteration, wouldn't you think? I mean, should we understand that the impulse to do this is essentially unchanged? That is the party still finding ways to co-opt or to coerce or otherwise induce media to toe the line while giving at least the appearance of widespread support that crosses class lines? I mean, it strikes me that these are near perfect tools to accomplish this. Do you see evidence that the old playbook, updated though it might be, is still in use?
Excellent question. I would agree. I think the old playbook is absolutely in use. That's what I'm arguing here.
That's what you're arguing. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the critical question, the critical word that you used there was, is this a system to co-opt or coerce a public narrative? And that's the fine detail that I'd like to point out, is that I don't think these individuals are doing this against their will. I think this is genuine representation of public opinion. It's just, of course, curated by the party to tell a certain narrative, right? Whether it's control of social media today, censoring certain posts and raising others, or through bots, etc., or publishing certain correspondent stories with that claim to truth value in the past. I think it's the same narrative, but it's that I think it's important to recognize that this is not coercion. This is actual genuine public participation. It's just curated by the party. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I can't wait to have lunch with you again and talk about this stuff. This is really great. I want to go first to Nick, who is also, of course, a Wrench paper, and I'm sure has some questions and some comments on it.
Thanks, Kaiser. And Donald, this was really, really excellent. I enjoyed the paper, and it was fantastic to see it with all the imagery in your presentation. I'm going to keep my comments brief so we can move to the audience, but I just wanted to mention how your work left me thinking about a potential political science puzzle. And for those listening, what sort of differentiates political science from history, at least as it's practiced in the US, is we seek to create generalizable theories about human behavior from particularly interesting or strange events. And whenever we encounter something that seems counterintuitive, our first thought is, what is this an instance of, and why does it happen? So my question is very much in that spirit, and I hope that the historians in the room will forgive me. But you demonstrate really effectively and compellingly how the newly created PRC mobilized newspaper correspondents from different backgrounds in order to strengthen relations between the regime and the masses through journalism. And this was really the key thesis of your paper. And you mentioned in your opening slide that this seems excitingly counterintuitive to what social scientists might anticipate about how an authoritarian state should govern, its official state-run media. So my question is, and in line with kind of Kaiser's earlier point, are there certain theoretical conditions under which opening and diversifying media voices can actually help autocrats stay in power? And I'm curious if similar mass line approaches are used in other autocratic states besides China and the USSR. And I get that this is sort of a Stalinist import, but could this occur in other autocratic states that are motivated by different ideologies, but in order to serve the same purpose of strengthening state-society relations? And I think there's probably a really cool book to be written on explaining how authoritarian countries control their media and public sentiment, and especially how they navigate this paradox of why they sometimes tolerate openness and diversity in the media when at some later point in time, those same tools can actually be used against them. And I just was curious if you had some thoughts to that broad question.
Yeah, you're about to make a great contribution to the whole growing literature on authoritarian resilience there, Donald. So let's hear what you have to say.
Well, there's a lot there, but first of all, I would say if we're talking about parallels, I wouldn't look towards any other autocratic states. I talk a lot about the United States in my research here. So I'm saying, this isn't that far off from what we see in social media narratives in the US. It's not that far from the shaping of public opinion narratives that we get through, it gets into tricky literature when I don't want to compare autocratic states to the more, obviously pluralistic system that we have here. But when you have news consumers who choose to only view, whether it's Fox News or CNN, you get similar strands of solidified narratives, I guess you could say, even within that pluralistic system. So if I had more time, or it's sort of a different discussion, but I would talk about those parallels with the United States, social media in both spheres, crystallizing, opinion in one direction or another through these narratives of truth value through public participation. I wanted to start at you might have to repeat the first part of your question again there. I got a little bit excited.
No, I think you got it mostly.
Okay, cool.
And I do want to leave a little bit of time to ask you, going away from political science and back into history. We have a question. It's a fascinating presentation. I was wondering if you saw any evolution of this local press infrastructure over time. For instance, did the 100 Flowers and the Cultural Revolution transform how these networks behaved? And if so, how? I know this falls a little out of the purview of your period that you studied to 56, sort of, the high tide of collectivization in that period. But beyond that, go a few years forward into the 100 Flowers movement.
No, my focus is through 1966. This study was just through 56. So,
okay, great.
For example, how do things evolve with the 100 Flowers movement? I have a separate chapter in my dissertation all about letters to the editor culture. So not the more solidified structure of correspondence, but just everyday individuals sending letters to the editor. And you see an explosion in this 100 Flowers moment of criticism of local party cadres that falls right in line with earlier, party narratives of we want individuals to participate in news production. So whether you think this 100 Flowers movement was genuine and then a trap into the anti-rightist movement, I think it shows the underlying amount of people who did want to participate critically in local party news systems. So the 100 Flowers movement is one moment where we see that explosion in participation. The Cultural Revolution, the launch of the Cultural Revolution in 1966, is another moment when we see an explosion in participation that really shows that sort of underswell of how, I guess, normalized and common it would have been for individuals to want to genuinely participate in local news, to criticize local party cadres, to advocate for different policy at local levels, even if it was met with immediate violence afterwards. It shows that sort of underlying general sentiment, I think, among the public.
Great, Donald. There's a question again from Xinyi, who's apparently really engaged with the seminar, so I'm delighted to see that. I think Xinyi asks, I think one way to investigate whether those mass correspondents really represented true public opinion might be to see the internal newspaper censorship system and how these correspondents were either encouraged or punished when they really reported public opinions. Even in the first place, how were they selected? What do you think? Do you know anything about the internal within the newspapers, how the system was run and governed?
Yeah, so most of what I know about the internal methods of, first of all, selecting individuals was you just sifted through however many people wrote to the newspaper, and you find the ones that are the most read, and you encourage those individuals through pairing them with an established journalist or pairing them with a member of the masses working group to then either you send them those materials, those 通讯yuan sort of 业务资料 that I showed earlier, that then tell them how to write articles. You encourage them through education, through revolutionary education, to write correct articles, ones that, for example, in one of the articles I found, or in one of the documents I said, found evidence that don't criticize economic cadres. Don't criticize anybody dealing with economic systems was in one of these documents. So you see them guiding individuals to write certain narratives. I think they're selected through that process of, sift through the amount that you have and then select the ones that are most read, educate them alongside you, then look at individuals like Duan Cunjiang, who eventually becomes part of the official, People's Daily infrastructure, rising through the ranks. They become semi-official in some senses. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how they rose through the ranks, how they selected people.
And because these were submissions that were sent in by mail on paper, really the file you would need to get your hand on to understand how things were censored or discounted would be the circular file. You need the garbage pail or whatever. And so it's unfortunately not really possible to get a window into that. But I think that what you've just suggested, looking at the directives and the guidance, that gives us a pretty strong clue as to what their priorities were. So thank you. That was an excellent question, Xinyi. And one more for you. Nick, can we do one more? Is it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, great. So this is a fairly quick one. Do you think some lessons should, and it connects with something you already said when you answered that question about whether this just reflects on authoritarian systems. Do you think some lessons should be or have been learned from these practices to encourage public participation and publish their complaints and sentiments in Western media outlets? I think you can see what that question was getting at.
Yeah. So what should we learn about publishing, these claims to truth value through public participation in Western media outlets? I don't have any deeper and credible insights. My first intervention that I want to say here is China is not radically different. That's I think step one that we have to look at, right? Both our media systems, whether you're in the cultural West or in the PRC under these authoritarian systems, share a lot in common when it comes to why people believe in the genuine nature of the news, claims to the truth value that happen through public participation are both common factors in why individuals believe the news in both places. So it's sort of returning to that first question that I had in my presentation. Is this real? Is the success of the PRC news system based on censorship, monolithic enterprises, top-down control? I am arguing for a reassessment that looks at both of our media systems as, one and the same in a sense. I think starting there can lead to, I guess, more clear-sighted understandings of what drives both our media systems.
Donald, thank you so much. This is fantastic. I'm so excited about the paper so far. We're going to take a 10-minute break right now. We'll be back at 10:25 sharply at 10:25. And tell friends, get on social media, tell people to come listen to this, because the next two papers that are coming up, the next three papers, are all really, really great. So let's bring some more people on board. All right.
And good afternoon or morning or evening, everyone. I'm Tabitha Speelman, a PhD candidate at Leiden University here in the Netherlands, where I work on a dissertation project on the politics of immigration to China. And in this project, I especially focus on the Chinese state, how it deals with foreign migration, from institutional reform to new policy development, and compared to outward and internal migration. This is a bit of a more recently emerging field that really came up together with the increase of immigration to China since the 2000s. So this hasn't been studied as much. Here on the right side here, there's some data from the 2010 census, which was the first to include foreign nationals. And since then, figures have been going up a bit to about 1 million foreign nationals at the moment. And during my fieldwork, I found that public opinion on immigration was also a factor in policy making, raising the question of what Chinese public opinion or Chinese immigration attitudes, as they're often called academically, actually are. So that's the question I address in this paper I'm discussing here today. And I would just, in these 15 minutes, hope to kind of briefly run you through the setup and some of the main findings and conclusions. And I'm just actually revising it to submit to a journal. So your feedback will be super useful. Let me, oh, why is it not going? Oh yeah. So let me start by briefly saying something how I aim to build on two fields of literature here. First, that of Chinese immigration. What do we already know about Chinese attitudes towards immigration? And the work that deals with this most directly has really focused on online debate, especially around controversies such as around African trader communities in Guangzhou. And overall, this discourse has been largely anti-immigration, and researchers have looked at this extreme and often racist discourse and analyzed it. At the same time as elsewhere, you wouldn't take online attitudes as representative of the wider population. Then there's another body of work that looks at local migrant interactions. And here right away, what stands out is that you see a broader spectrum of attitudes, not just negative ones. And also you see this change over time. And then finally, studies that some great theoretical work that has looked at Chinese discourses on ethnicity, race, and national identity more broadly, such as the work of Ye Hongcheng or Chen Zhang that some of you might know as well. So we do know some things, but these findings are really mostly about specific groups, and there's been very little data published on the subject. For instance, there's no regular polling on immigration attitudes in China, and also policy attitudes have hardly been studied. The second field is that of immigrant reception more broadly, and this is a huge, very quantitative interdisciplinary literature, which I definitely can't summarize, but just to pull out a few points that I draw on in this paper. One is that the findings, or the growing consensus that out of this quantitative literature, that ideas about how a country is doing have greater explanatory power in explaining immigration attitudes than factors related to individuals, natives' individual interests. So, for instance, how positive or negative I am about immigration to Holland is more about what I think immigration can do for Dutch society or not, than about whether I'm going to lose my job to a migrant or not, for instance. The second point here is that of the spectrum of immigration attitudes. Really, most research has focused on anti-immigration attitudes and in Western context specifically, but more recently, researchers have looked at this broader spectrum and have actually, like in this paper pictured here, found that in many countries there's a more moderate or ambivalent majority. Then finally, there's some qualitative research of this too, and here also researchers find that individuals often link immigration to national identity and also are more flexible and neutral in their attitudes than media and political discourse might suggest. So in this paper, I build on these two literatures to find out more about attitudes towards immigration among a broad cross-section of Chinese citizens. What are their attitudes toward this increase in immigration in the last decades, and how do they frame them? What patterns do I find? What aspects of national identity are really relevant in the Chinese case? These questions come up, and I look at them using a primarily qualitative approach, aided by survey results that help me triangulate and support my findings. So first, the paper draws on these semi-structured interviews conducted in 3 locations, Shanghai, Jinan, and a town in Zhejiang called Pinghu. And half of them were done by me and half by 3 Chinese research assistants, also to see if responses would be different. Then there is an online survey on immigration attitudes. I was part of a small team doing that at East China University of Science and Technology, asking a lot of questions about immigration that are common in these surveys but hadn't been asked in China before. And then there's some data from these big, very established surveys that actually did include some questions on immigration, but these just hadn't really been looked at. So now to the findings. These are the subheadings in my paper, just to give you a sense of the topics it covers. Of course, I can't get into all these things. But most importantly, there's this key finding that kind of cuts across these subheadings, namely that I find that respondents describe an ongoing shift in perceptions of foreign nationals coming to live and work in China. And I actually thought my focus in this paper was going to be more on the diversity of attitudes. And I did find that, and I think it's important to highlight, also to complement some of these existing studies that focus more on critical attitudes. But as I was working on this, what stood out the most were things that were actually broadly shared across demographics. So I'm discussing a shared frame within which there was, of course, a lot of diversity. And briefly stated, that's the idea that with China's development, the role of immigration in Chinese society is changing, and that this should have implications for Chinese immigration policy as well. So for both these issues, I'll just give a few examples from the paper. So for this changing role of immigration in society, in interviews, respondents talk about the shift when they frame the impact of immigration. Often many highlight the economic contribution of foreign nationals as they see it, and especially in the early period of reforms, and then sort of contrast it with a more recent situation in which foreigners are less needed, and some are perceived as being less needed as China had more domestic talent, for instance. So some thought that now immigration no longer offered any benefits. Others thought it was now more about cultural diversity or other issues, or simply that it was a more normal part of being an internationalized society. So you see that shift reflected on this issue of the impact of immigration. Also in this figure from the World Values Survey, you see that responses were overwhelmingly neutral to positive. Another aspect of this change is more psychological. This was something that came up in basically every interview, this idea of the normalization of immigrants to China, and how people would often draw on their memories of how it used to be so special, and they would sort of see these encounters as something to really remember. But of course, this was no longer the case, and is often linked to international mobility in both directions. For instance, this quote here in the top corner, "I'm no longer intrigued. When we Chinese go abroad, we are foreigners as well," same thing. Was very common sort of sentiment, but actually this person, a shopkeeper in Shanghai, had not been abroad. So it was just more part of societal discourse more broadly now. Then for the second point of the policy implications of this shift, here I want to focus on the issue of immigrant control and selection, just for time's sake, and go a bit into that. So based on online discourse, you might think that most Chinese people want reduced migration, and a sizable minority does. But in our interviews, the discourse that China should continue to welcome immigrants or even increase immigrant flows is definitely more dominant. One idea here is that as China is a stronger country, like internationalization is sort of part of that. China could take a bit of a challenge, as one person put it. But at the same time, as China is considered more attractive, it should also become more selective in who it lets in. And here people reference foreign immigration control a lot, like this idea that the US is a lot more selective than China. But also, interestingly, Chinese internal migration and this idea of fairness with internal migrants, who of course are often still also face settlement restrictions within the country. And yeah, so this minority has been quite stable in size over the last decade, but its makeup has changed. But maybe we can get more into that with the Q&A. So this distribution of attitudes you can also see in this chart, with the red and the purple being the people who were critical when reduced migration, and a slightly bigger share, green and blue, who says they would like some more, and also a lot of stable. And then for these ideas about fairness and migrant selection, these were most strongly expressed on the idea of on the issue of policies that aim to attract foreign migrants, such as providing these sort of bigger government scholarships for foreign students compared to those for Chinese students. And these issues have been in Chinese media a lot. There's more public knowledge around them than around many other immigration policies. And this was a guard in Xinan who said, well, you know, there was a time for that, but that time is no longer. So very much that, that chronological framing. And speaking of chronological, I'd like to just zoom out a little bit here, more towards like a longer timeline. Yeah, across surveys, it can be hard to compare questions, but if you put the data from these various surveys together, it's quite clear that Chinese respondents were most positive about immigration in the late 2000s. So that's sort of this dip here in the top line. And surveys after 2015 show a modest rise in anti-immigrant sentiment. So that kind of maps on quite nicely to what we would normally think of as these phases of development more broadly, in which the 2000s are more about connecting to the world, while the 2010s have been more characterized by this projection of China as a more confident, globally competitive power. So yeah, I won't really go into this graph in detail, but just to give you a sense of this larger timeline. So onto the discussion. What does this all mean? As you just saw, I find a moderate majority in views towards immigration across a range of variables, but also some shifts within some groups, most notably younger age groups, and also an overall rise in criticism of certain aspects of immigration versus the late 2000s. And in terms of the framing of these attitudes, I find that respondents put their views of China's rapid socioeconomic development really front and center in their evaluation, both of personal interactions with immigrants, as well as of the different immigration policy areas. And this idea that China is now in a different position in a global hierarchy of development is definitely very relevant to people's immigration views. So in contrast to an earlier reform era where China was seen to be sort of more open, more indiscriminately, and learning, as many people put it, the country is now considered more attractive to migrants, which is largely seen as a good thing, but also increases public demand for more control over immigration. So what can such a developmental lens, as I put it, add to our understanding of these fields that we looked at the beginning of this presentation? So for the China immigration literature, I would say my paper provides, some further evidence, some new data on previous studies that show that perceptions have been changing, right? And that native migrant interactions have been changing over the last decade. But there's also some clear differences. So for one, in my results, there's less emphasis on anti-immigrant sentiment than in some other studies. I find this moderate majority that's often sort of left out a bit of discourse. My findings also highlight some aspects of societal change in the reform era that are highly relevant to the issue of immigration, but not usually linked to it, such as the huge increase in Chinese people's experience of mobility, both within and outside China, and the demand for foreign exchange and contact that there was for a lot of it, and still is to some extent. And lastly, on this point, racialized perceptions of foreigners have been the focus of much study, and I think this is rightly so. But these findings do show that they are not the only dimension in people's evaluation of immigrants and immigration policy. So we asked these more open questions, and respondents were free to bring up any aspect, and issues of race and ethnicity certainly did come up, but more dominant were ideas about migrants' economic contribution, ability to integrate or keep the law, or whether they had families in China or not. So that seems worth adding to the conversation. And I think a next step would be to look more closely at how these issues intersect. Then, I don't know how I'm doing for time. Do I have another minute here? Or?
Yeah, you can have another minute.
Okay, thanks. Just on what this adds to the more broader immigrant reception literature beyond China, I think basically, I do find that the Chinese case fits quite nicely with some of that literature on the importance of these state of the nation concerns and national identity narratives. But it can also bring out something in that it highlights a pattern of host society responses that are quite different from the more larger literature on countries whose citizens mostly consider their country developed. For instance, here in Western Europe, the discussion on immigrant attitudes often departs from the assumption that people's native country is a highly attractive immigrant destination and that everyone wants to come here. And by contrast, my findings on China also highlight like a certain pride in the country's increased ability to attract immigrants and also some confidence in the state's capacity to actually deal with that increase, but also frustration on immigrants being privileged on local residents in some aspects and concern with the country's global reputation. So of course, these narratives would differ in different countries, but I would certainly expect that this pattern of attitudes is not unique to China. And also that the Chinese case might have something to add here to the study of immigrant reception beyond these high income Western contexts. At the same time though, and this is my final point, the Chinese case offers an important reminder of change over time. The development has been so fast, and Chinese individuals very much remember just how recently they felt very differently about immigrants and immigration. And now 2 years on from my research, it might already be a bit different at a different point in this shift. So as so often, China sort of doesn't fit these categories, and it's also a good reminder of how unstable they are and how we just need to study these attitudes on the ground. So thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your question.
Thank you, Tabitha. This was excellent, and it's truly fascinating. And yeah, I imagine that just in the last few years, especially given the COVID epidemic, I'm sure that attitudes about immigration have maybe shifted even further still. I really like the way that you put this through this developmental lens and just sort of saw it. And I think that the most compelling of the data slides that you showed was the shift in attitudes that we saw toward immigration, and how there was sort of the most positive period in that period of sort of high cosmopolitanism in the 2005 to 2009 period, and how it's shifted ever since. The negatives have risen. I'm imagining a European or a North American who has lived in China, as many have for many years, reading your paper and thinking of him or herself as not falling somehow under the category of immigrant. And just as easily, I mean, you point this out when you talk about what Lao Wai means in Chinese. I can imagine a Chinese person being asked about immigration and his or her mind going immediately, say, to immigrants from Southeast Asia or from Africa, rather than somehow imagining Europeans or Euro-Americans. Were you explicit with your interview subjects or with your survey takers about defining what an immigrant is, or did you allow them to maybe self-define what foreigner meant or what immigrant meant?
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess that's one of the definitions we could discuss here. We actually asked about foreigners, because the term in China is, I guess, as you know, not commonly associated with foreigners living in China, but not because there's like a clear distinction that we want to make between short term and long term, because in the academic literature, immigrant just sort of gets used in this broad sense, like a United Nations definition, just basically anyone living abroad elsewhere.
Right.
But foreigners was just a more recognizable term. And then in terms of questions, we also did in the survey ask about people from different geographical regions and some other background questions, but most of them were about foreigners per se, which seemed worth doing, because while obviously people have to fill in a lot of the interpretation themselves, that is also what happens when these questions are asked in Western contexts or in other contexts. It seems like worth doing in China as well.
Oh, absolutely. No, I can imagine somebody, in your country, in the Netherlands, when you say foreigner, their mind immediately goes to, somebody from an Islamic country, somebody from North Africa or from the Middle East, rather than to a Canadian, right? A white Canadian. It's in your conclusion, you hint at the significance of one of your findings, one that I thought was really intriguing too, which is that educated correspondent or respondents to the surveys and to your questions have in recent years grown more polarized over the pros and cons of immigration. And this seems to reflect patterns that you've seen in the global north. What are some of the shared drivers of this? I mean, my sense is that looking at a lot of this right-wing populist rhetoric that we're now seeing even among educated people in China, the sort of pro-Trump Chinese, the anti-Baizuo Chinese people. And I mean, I saw recently on your Twitter feed that you had revisited Chen Shenzhang's great piece on right-wing populism with Chinese characteristics. Are you hearing a lot of these same echoes? And how does that fit into the developmental model, or does it at all? Is this outside of the purview of the developmental lens? This seems like more sort of a global populist kind of, almost a cultural kind of infection of viral spread.
Yeah, no, I think it is very relevant to what's going on with immigrant, like public opinion more broadly in China, in the sense that you do have this group that's very vocal, that to some extent, because overall immigration to China is not one of China's top salient issues. So this group is very, has to some extent driven the debate on this, right, especially online. And that's especially, as Chen Shenzhang also writes about, since 2015, the refugee crisis in Europe, and very much just copying some of the alt-right discourse in the West, but also recombining it with some Chinese themes. And I think what's interesting is that I would say we do see that reflected in these national data, possibly in this critical minority now being more highly educated. Like if you look at that, yes, that was the point I didn't quite explain on the slide. If you look at the people saying immigration should be reduced in the 90s and early 2000s, that group was mostly older and less educated. And now that group is also more highly educated and younger. And with the younger group, you see this polarization, and that's very clear, across these surveys. So I would say that does probably reflect, some of these nationalist trends among university students and other highly educated groups, sort of the Zhou crowd, so to say.
Yeah, exactly, the Zhou crowd. China's Quora, the weird alt-right Quora of China. One more question before I hand over to Natasha for hers, and then go to the audience. How do you think the discourse on China's demographics, this recent sense of urgency over low birth rates, over the sort of fading away of the once prevalent idea that China was too overpopulated, how is that impacting thinking about immigration? Did that come up at all in any of the interviews or in the survey data that you looked at?
We did ask about it, but you could sort of see that as it is in the debate in China, it's not really seen as a realistic policy solution to greatly increase immigration. So the survey results weren't very notable, but some people would bring it up, like more highly educated interviewees would sometimes bring it up as something that China sort of needs to do. Like in Japan, I guess the debate has been like earlier or later. But yeah, I don't think that connection has been made, and on the one made very across the board. On the other hand, when you look at this right wing, so that's actually another paper I'm doing. When you look more at this right wing discourse, you do see a lot of people, worried that will be a direction China takes, and making also, for kind of understandable reasons, also links to family planning policies, and being like, well, how can we start having an immigration policy when we still had family planning so recently? So that is definitely a theme in some parts of the discourse.
Thank you. Over to you, Natasha. I'm sorry.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Tabitha. Another really, really interesting talk for us all today, and such an important topic. I mean, given the size of China's population, I think the work looking at how Chinese citizens themselves experience and see immigration is definitely still under-focused in the field of Chinese studies. So really, really interesting. And as for your primary research, I think that was a particular pull of this paper when Nick and I were looking over the paper submissions. Really interesting to see that you've done these 46 interviews over the course of your time in China. I'm just wondering, I'm always interested in, how geography affects these kind of polls, particularly in a country as large as China. Did you or do you expect to see different attitudes and thoughts towards immigrants in China coming from different provinces, particularly say a border province up in the north compared to a southern province like Yunnan on the border of Southeast Asia, compared to somewhere more central like Hunan or Henan? I was just wondering if that was something that you'd considered in your research.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so maybe first of all, to your point of this diversity that you would expect in a country as big as China, I think what I do like about having done this more national survey is that you can pinpoint, in a way, you can locate this more extreme group that a lot of the research has looked at, but you can also see how it's only part of the story, right? Like how there is just like that moderate majority and also just all other kinds of interesting viewpoints. And then for the geographical distribution, of course, some of these surveys, like our survey did have respondents just from all over the country looking for controlling for a few variables. So in that sense, I wouldn't expect some big surprises, but just qualitatively, of course, the discourse differs in different regions. Again, less than I expected, like doing interviews in Shanghai, Jinan, and Pinghu. I would have expected actually some, maybe, I don't know, some more obvious differences. For instance, more anti-immigrant attitudes in places with few immigrants. But actually, there seems to be some sort of, these national discourses, of course, structure thinking also across the country. In Shandong, there was more referencing of Chinese culture, like things like that. In Shanghai, of course, people had a bit more experience dealing with foreigners, and we're talking more about Asian migrants, who are the biggest foreign groups in Shanghai. For another paper I've done researching Guangxi at the border, there Vietnamese migrants are the dominant group, and there's also a long history there. So in a way, there seems to be even less controversy. So yeah, definitely differences. But again, somehow some of these shared things stood out the most to me.
Tabitha, we have a question from an audience member named Wei Min Yuan, not so directly related to the presentation, but how does China and generally Chinese people, how do they view overseas Chinese who want to or have returned to China? Somebody like me, for example, are they welcomed warmly or treated with suspicion? And again, this is one of those things that's in flux. And this really touches on another question that I was hoping to sneak in, which was, I mean, your paper really is all about sort of conceptions of nationhood, right? A lot of it is about, whether China is, the question of immigration is ultimately about what makes a nation. Right. And I was hoping that maybe you could, in the last couple of minutes we have here, just reflect a little bit on that and how overseas Chinese might fit in.
Whoa, that's a big one. I guess one, interesting question about overseas Chinese, I think almost requires its own research project. Of course, I'd say national identity narratives, and somehow the one that really stands out to me here is the developmental one, which of course is a major narrative in China's story over the last 40 years. But of course, there's many others, like who can be Chinese. Like we didn't really go into to nationality as much. More, I think what's maybe noteworthy about this research is that it kind of asked people to think about this immigration reality, this de facto immigration reality of foreigners living in China often for decades as well, and asking their opinion on that rather than asking, are these foreigners Chinese now, for instance, where right. It would also be interesting to see what people would say, but we didn't ask that. And I think it was interesting that in a way you see the grassroots version of these also state and big developmental narratives where people drew their own conclusions and said things like, well, if foreigners are here for so long, well, why couldn't they settle here just the same way that Chinese peoples are settling down in the US and getting a green card in Singapore, et cetera, et cetera. So in a way, these grassroots answers and responses were often sort of taking the developmental narrative to its logical conclusions, like the interactions that have happened in these recent decades, in a way that the immigration framework, the policy framework, is not there yet, right? Like permanent residency is still hardly available. Right. So you could see that for many respondents, it doesn't mean they think these foreigners are Chinese. It doesn't mean that they're especially close to these foreign communities or that there's great integration or anything like that. That would be sort of another issue. But they did sort of see, many did see this as part of Chinese society right now. And in that sense, you could say part of the nation as it is at the moment.
Tabitha, thank you so much for this excellent paper. Another great contribution, and I'm really looking forward to engaging with you more about it offline and maybe even on the show to talk about this, because this is really interesting work. All right, let's move right on to this next one I'm also very, very excited about, with a title that references Sima Guang, the great Northern Song historian. We have Zhou presenting his paper, Comprehensive Mirror in Aid of U.S.-China Relations, Views of a Rising Generation, in which he looks at the viewpoints on America of America watchers in China, a young generation of America specialists. Jason, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kaiser. It's such an honor to get the chance to present at the symposium alongside such amazing other co-presenters, and also as a longtime reader of SupChina and fan of the Sinica podcast, and amused to see that the SupChina history column this week also mentioned was referencing Comprehensive Mirror. So very fortuitous. I'm currently a student at Schwarzman College in Tsinghua, and I'm going to present today about, as Kaiser mentioned, China's America Watchers. So Chinese scholars have long had an impact on policymaking since the ancient Confucius-educated scholars of the imperial dynasties to 1985, Dao Ziyang inviting both foreign and domestic academics to attend a conference at Bashan to talk about how China can reform and open up. And since then, Chinese policymakers have continued to consult scholars for their views on a wide range of issues. And therefore, I think that understanding the views of these scholars can provide an important lens on understanding Chinese foreign policy views and decision-making. So I decided to look at some rising stars of China's America hands, by which I mean those who focus on studying the US primarily as their main area of study, looking at rising stars, people who are younger than the Wang Yisis, the Jing Sanrongs, the Yan Zhetongs of the world, folks who are going to be the most influential voices in this field in the coming 5, 10, 15, 20 years. This is an update to David Shambaug's 1993 book, partial update, I guess, which assessed the overall state of America watching within China from 1972, from the reestablishment of U.S.-China, or the sort of like reopening of China to 1990. And I will use it to chart some understandings of what future Chinese assessments of the US could be. These scholars, they will be the most influential in the field in coming years, and they will be consulting the government on these issues. They may provide advice to the government uses. They may reflect, their debates may reflect debates that are occurring within the government. And they will also shape some of the bounds of in which sort of respectable debate, respectable discussion occurs. So I think it is a very important and useful issue to be looking at. Diving quickly into the methodology, I selected 11 rising stars who are sort of listed in this list here, based on various factors. Age of approximately 35 to 47, mainly based on sort of how much time I thought it was necessary to give them to like establish a name for themselves, become very prominent without becoming the most becoming the highest level of scholars in the field. Looking at their influence based on publications in various academic journals, media, etc. Expertise, they're all sort of very well, they all have a wealth of expertise on the US with some differing levels of types of experience, and they all have perceived influence among other Chinese America watchers who are not within this cohort. My main methods were textual analysis, reading and skimming articles, mostly in Chinese, really trying to gain a deep understanding of how these people, these scholars think, and then a series of interviews, managing to interview 6 of these 11 scholars, as well as some other American and Chinese scholars of US-China relations. And then let's see. Okay, and then so there are several main questions that I was looking at. The broad question was, right, what are the assumptions and views of China's rising generation of America watchers? And I split that up into a variety of questions, some focused primarily on the US, what is the situation of the US, and then some focused primarily on US-China relations, and then some on policy recommendations. So diving straight into it, one question is about declinism. So one of the people that I actually interviewed told me that they think that Americans are too obsessed with the question of whether or not the US is declining. And unfortunately, I'm going to fuel that obsession right now. And I actually do think it is an important question, whether or not Chinese scholars think that the US is declining, and it's an area where there is significant debate. Rush Doshi, former or current NSC, one of the NSC directors for China, wrote in The Long Game about how he thinks that the phrase "great changes unseen in a century" is sort of code word for China viewing, sort of seeing imminent US decline, and that China is trying to seize that opportunity. My finding, at least among this cohort, is that there actually is there's a lot of diversity in views, and no person in this cohort actually supports the view that Rush Doshi articulated of an imminent US decline. So just sort of going through this table really quickly, uncertain relative declinists are those who think that the US is declining in a relative manner, but they're actually not sure if China will ever overtake the US in comprehensive national power, in sort of all measures of national power. They think it's likely that China will overtake the US economically, but they're not as certain about in a comprehensive manner. The confident relative declinists are those who think that China will actually overtake the US eventually in relative national power, in comprehensive national power. It is relative US decline, and it will take a long time, but eventually China will get there. And then there are a couple of folks I identified who do think that the US is in absolute decline. So the US is things are actually getting worse in the US from these people's views. But they still think it's going to take a long time for China to overtake the US. So what we see here, right, is that actually not that many people in this cohort think that the US is actually like going backwards as a country, is like declining absolutely as a country. But there is a decent amount of confidence that China will eventually overtake the US, and very little view that China will actually overtake the US in a very short time period. And sort of on this also topic of America's status in the world and strength, I also looked into their views of US sources of strength as well as sources of weakness. Most of them focus on US military as well as US innovation as key sources of strength for the US. And most of them also focus on the political system in the US as key source of weakness. So this points to the fact that they do think that the US still has a lot of strengths. They still see a lot of things that the US is really, really good at. And China has sort of unlikely to catch up to the US in these areas anytime soon. And interestingly enough, some of these are topics or domains where the US is perhaps especially worried about China in terms of China's sort of China's dominance of AI, perhaps, or China's various other technological advances, as well as modernization of the PLA. But actually, these scholars seem to think that the US is doing quite well on those fronts. They point mainly at the US political system as the main source of weakness. And so these sort of offset in different ways. It's hard to tell exactly whether or not they think these strengths will prevail or the weaknesses will prevail. And most likely, I think these strengths and weaknesses will remain for some time and be in conflict with each other. But they do see both important strengths and weaknesses. So turning now to what exactly is going on in US-China relations. I try to understand whether or not they think competitions are mostly competitive or cooperative. Secretary Blinken likes to refer to 3 C's: competitive, cooperative, and confrontational or adversarial. I focused mostly on competition and cooperation because it was sort of easier to get a gauge for this, and very few people were sort of talking or advocating for directly confrontational or fully confrontational relations. And the main finding here is that mostly they see competition and some amount of cooperation, but there's more emphasis on the cooperative side. Even though that may look like a bad thing, I don't necessarily think that is a bad thing, because in some ways it's good for, because I mean, I would say that my own view is that the relationship is fundamentally competitive, or that sort of competition does dominate the relationship more than cooperation at the moment. And I think it's good that these scholars have a sort of, in my view, I guess, pretty much accurate view of that situation and aren't sort of buying too much into Chinese government hopes that by the US coming to its senses, the relationship can return to its sort of like destined cooperative state. And by acknowledging that there is competition, that also opens the door for more focus on various confidence building measures or policies to manage and guide the competition to make sure it doesn't go out of hand. And many of the scholars who did talk about the competitive aspect of the relationship do also talk about those areas. And you can see below some of the quotes that scholars in each of these categories use when I would ask them, or from their articles, quotes about how they would describe the relationship. So right, we have like ideas of like competitive, peaceful coexistence, and the sort of middle category. Wang Dong talks about a new engagement consensus, whereas some people who are focused more on the competition aspect talk about recognizing the reality of competition and talking about sort of a long-term strategic game. Now, okay, so there is competition, but why is there competition? So actually, one scholar that I talked to said that, so most of the discussion of why competition exists, or most discussion for why US-China relations are currently in a bad state, does focus on US actions. But one scholar that I talked to said that no serious America hand will claim that the entire reason for the downturn in US-China relations over the past several years is the US's fault, which is a very interesting sort of thing for them to express to me. But when I was looking through their works and when I was talking to these scholars, they mostly focus on 3 areas as sources of competition, and they don't really focus on ideology, which is interesting, and which is a potential blind spot, which could be the result of various things. Some folks look at ideology as more of an instrument, and that could reflect a sort of misunderstanding or a sort of suspicion of US discussion of human rights, et cetera, as mostly an instrument rather than actually a driving force behind US policy. And especially in the Biden administration, I think there is a good argument for thinking that some of these ideological aspects do have a fundamental driving force behind the policy, not necessarily 100%, but some fundamental driving force. But the primary explanatory factors that these scholars focused on were what I term power politics, domestic politics, and security dilemma. Power politics, I think it means mostly a sort of like offensive realist type explanation, where they think that because the US has some imperative, believes that the US, for various reasons, either historical or sort of ideological or some other reasons, or just power related reasons, feels some need to like dominate China's near abroad, and that activity drives defensive Chinese activity. So it is actually offensive on the US side, but defensive on China's side. One is domestic politics. So it's mainly because the US, either because of Trump or because Biden himself has various incentives to achieve sort of bipartisanship, or because China is one, or like being tough on China is one of the policies that US Congress can be unified on. Domestic politics as an explanation. And then some folks also talk about security dilemma, and talk about how, you know, the US and China, how it's primarily the US and China misinterpreting actions on either side, and that causes each side to sort of build up their militaries or to engage in more hardline policies against each other. So these, you know, they're mostly fairly, I think they're fairly standard and fairly, I think they're all sort of have some element of truth in them, and doesn't necessarily speak to making it easier to resolve any of these particular issues, but I think it's good that they all sort of fixate on, or like focus on, reasonable sources for US-China competition, although there is, I think, less emphasis on ideology than perhaps there should be. And then talking a bit about policy recommendations. So what should we actually be doing about it? From these scholars' points of view, actually, I think probably pretty positively from an American standpoint, is that most of the focus, or there is more discussion of cooperation, and of various other sort of like competition management policies. So cooperation then entails sort of like trade deals, opening up more channels of communication, and a bunch of people are in favor of crisis management. So that's very good. Something that, you know, trying to make sure that any sort of competition, the competition that most people do think exists, does not spin out of control. But there is a decent amount of folks who do talk about China needing to struggle harder. So, you know, Dojeng, China needing to, you know, be more active either on the global arena or also needing to develop countermeasures against various US weapons such as sanctions or the US dollar. And I think, yeah, overall, I think this actually presents a pretty rosy or pretty positive picture from US perspective, in that there's no sort of like dominant trend towards struggle or dominant trend towards hardline policies on the US, at least from these scholars. And then lastly, I'll talk briefly about this sort of idea of hegemony. It's not really the bailiwick of any of these scholars, it's not really the bailiwick of any of these scholars. They're American scholars, first and foremost. They're not necessarily sort of like strategists. They're not necessarily strategists, but there's just an interesting trend that kept on coming up, is that almost all of them, 8 out of 11, talked to me about, or they directly mentioned in their works, that China should not pursue even regional hegemony, which is probably which is one of the main sort of like worries about the US, in addition to sort of like global norms, et cetera. And most of the reason for that is because they mostly think that it's actually not good, like it's not actually an achievable goal at acceptable cost for China. So a lot of these scholars see hegemony, or at least they claim to see hegemony, as fairly costly and not actually yielding many benefits, for various different reasons, and therefore not something that China should attempt to pursue. So, you know, not necessarily much interest in, for instance, driving US military forces out of Japan and out of Korea, which I think is one of, which I believe is sort of like a top worry of US policymakers, as an eventual Chinese objective. So in conclusion, America watchers are diverse. They hold a range of views, but actually they don't trend towards extreme negative views of the US, and they actually probably don't trend towards extreme positive views of the US. They have, I think, fairly reasonable, fairly middle of the road views. American China watchers should not believe that Chinese elite discussions are irredeemably hawkish and nationalistic. There's a lot of nuance going on in at least the discussions among the highest level of experts. There is a lot more nationalistic commentary occurring in other expert circles. That is certainly true. You know, there are other scholars who are less careful, more perhaps unscrupulous, or just have more extreme views. But at least the highest level of scholarship in China is not irredeemably hawkish, and they're advocating for policies that have a great mix of policies, that have a great mix of cooperation and competition, and there does obviously remain additional work in mapping out the full America watching ecosystem, given that I only looked at 11 scholars between the ages of 35 and 47, but hopefully it was a helpful start. And I'm happy to take, of course, any questions and would love to receive any feedback that anyone has at the email address below. Thank you all.
Jason, thank you so much. That was outstanding and a nice, succinct summary of your research. The timing of my reading of your paper, which was earlier this week or last week, was really interesting because I had just finished reading an interview with Wang Jisi, wherein he actually talks just like one of your 11 younger American hand subjects, and even though he's older, he's very, very much established. He even talks like those who are on the more sort of liberal or internationalist wing of that cohort that you looked at. He focuses on many of the same drivers of competition. He identifies many sources of American durability and resilience, and in fact, identifies the very same ones that your cohort really focuses on. He downplays very much, and this is probably central to that interview, the idea of American absolute decline or even precipitous relative decline. I'm wondering, did you read that interview? And if so, what were your thoughts?
Yes, so I skimmed that interview. I haven't had a chance to look at it really deeply, but it's definitely on near the top of my list. I think my main reaction is that it makes a lot of sense, because I think Wang Jisi, first of all, is obviously one of the top scholars in the field, more esteemed, more established than any of the ones that I studied. He's also reputed to be more sort of like liberal-minded, right? More sort of perhaps pro-US, or just like more sympathetic to US positions on some things.
An eagle hugger, right?
Yeah, and so it doesn't necessarily surprise me that he holds those views, and it makes a lot of sense that he would be on the sort of very reasonable end of, or sort of on that end of what I was seeing from the people that I was researching. Mm-hmm. I think the part of the reason for me trying to conduct this research is to have a more comprehensive view of like, what are the debates going on? Because I think it's easy, I think it's very tempting or easy to focus on various of the leading voices, including Wang Jisi, because we know who they are, we can recognize their names, and we know that they are prominent. But having an understanding of the overall ecosystem is more helpful necessarily, I think, than seeing one person's voice, because then you can put all of the voices into the sort of understand where they are in the spectrum, and understand the sort of suite of advice that is coming to the Chinese government. Because who knows, maybe Wang Jisi is influential, maybe he's not. I have no idea, and it's hard absent his presence at a Politburo study session to know how much influence he has. But seeing how the field overall develops gives us, I think, a better understanding of which types of advice are going to Zhou High.
So I've got one comment to make, and then I'm going to hand back over to Nick, and he's got some comments and questions. And I see already one excellent question in the audience that actually preempted something that I was originally planning on asking you. But my comment basically is that the takeaway from this really interesting paper is that we in the U.S., as you said, we really need to revisit and we really need to interrogate this assumption, not just of the general hawkishness of the American watching establishment in China, but also there's this assumption that seems to have become extremely prevalent within the Beltway, especially that about Chinese political elites being largely in accord when it comes to intentions. China, I think it's widely believed, intends to displace the United States as the global hegemon, or at the very least, as regional hegemon. But as your research bears out from just looking at this core of 11 people, 8 of the 11 don't even see Chinese pursuit of regional hegemony as in China's national interests. Clearly, this is not the case. They are not as Americans imagine them to be. While some people would point to their relative political irrelevance or impotence, and that's something that your participants confess to for sure. I would say that this cohort is more likely to get closer to power than it is to actually fundamentally change its views profoundly in the coming decades. So I think that there's a very good chance that we will see the views that this cohort shares move closer to a mainstream view if we don't, sort of antagonize them unnecessarily. So yeah, fantastic, great paper. Nick, did you have any comments or questions that you wanted to direct to Jason?
I do. Well, I'll keep this brief because I know we have questions from the audience. But first of all, Jason, congratulations. It sounds like you really made the most of your time in China, and this was a fabulous use of kind of semi-structured interviews and very careful selection of your subjects. So I want to commend you on that. I have a quick question, which is that as you point out in your paper, what you're really exploring here is a powerful illustration of something that you already alluded to, which is, of course, the security dilemma, which is a fancy thing that international relations scholars use to describe a situation in which two actors that are basically fundamentally security-seeking and non-revisionist can still end up in conflict because neither side can trust that the actions of their adversary are defensive rather than offensive. And, of course, one of the most famous scholars to formalize this idea was the late Robert Jervis, whose book Perception and Misperception you cited in your paper. And the whole point of your study, as I took it, was that if we can really unpack these perceptions on both sides, we can have a better and more stable U.S.-China relations future moving forward. And so I'd like to hear more just about what your empirical findings reveal about our understanding of the security dilemma, what causes it to intensify, what can ameliorate it, and particularly what these Chinese scholars thought about that. Because I'm kind of puzzled in the best possible way by your findings, which is that if Chinese and US scholars are actually fairly aligned in their views, and they agree that their rival is actually security seeking, and it would appear that the latest generation of US and Chinese scholars seemed fairly aligned and that they're more integrated with the policy decision-making apparatus than they have been in the past, why have US-China relations deteriorated so badly at a time when states, I think, have been more open to intervention from the academy? And my initial reaction is there was a huge debate within the US political science community. There was a scholar named Mike Desch who published a very controversial book called The Cult of the Irrelevant, in which he argued that DC policymakers and national security were not taking social scientists seriously. But the difference is that when you're in a Leninist party state like China, the academic environment is heavily integrated, into the party. And so I don't know which way that swings. And also, of course, Chung Li has written a book on Chinese think tanks that also sort of challenges the assumption that the left hand isn't talking to the right. So, what did your interview subjects have to say about this?
Okay. Yes. Excellent question. Thank you so much. A couple of thoughts. So one is that on the security dilemma, I think there's a couple of different mechanisms at play that scholars that was sort of like evident from what scholars wrote, because you can have security dilemma that's based mostly around defensive actions by both sides, but some scholars believe that the attributed more responsibility to what the sort of a U.S. desire to sort of like dominate and U.S. desire to sort of, I guess, pursue unipolarity and hegemony, that is, or actions that are closer to the Chinese mainland, and sort of an asymmetry of interest that produces, that they focus on. Whereas I think some are focused more on what they view as sort of like more reasonable U.S. concerns, or like U.S. concerns about either trade or some concerns about like safety of allies in the Pacific and stuff like that. So it depends to some degree on how exactly they see U.S. actions and whether or not they assess U.S. actions as primarily defensive or offensive. One other, so point two is that I think there's actually, I wouldn't say that I'm not sure that there's consensus in the American Academy or among American scholars about Chinese intentions, right? So there's like tons of debate over whether or not China wants to pursue regional hegemony, whether it wants to pursue global hegemony. And I think there aren't that many people who think that China wants to pursue something below regional hegemony in the long term. And to be fair, some of the scholars are also like, some of the scholars that I talk also say, yes, I mean, we would love to have regional hegemony. That would be nice if we could have like if we could have East Asia be like the Americas for the US, that would sure be nice, but there's no path to that for what they could see in terms of realistic ways to actually achieve that for the United States, for China.
No, sorry. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You inspired me to really think about this debate, because it's such an excellent paper. And the real sense I have is that I don't think that there's a divide, at least within U.S. academics who study China, about their behavior. It's more this divide between people at more hawkish or conservative kind of think tanks in the Beltway. And I think what really struck me was that there isn't a doubt, at least in my mind, after seeing your results, that I do think that Chinese and U.S. scholars do view this situation, very similarly, in which we're all potentially defensive realists, right? We're not offensive. And the sense is that if you overextend and if you seek regional hegemony, right, the system smacks you back. It punishes you because other states form alliances or try to balance against you. And in many ways, I think China's behavior, right, and the fact that they haven't really fought a war since 1979, right, I think it demonstrates this exact point that you're alluding to, which is that regional hegemony and involvement overseas is a potential recipe for disaster, that in many ways they've learned, from the US experience. But sorry, I just wanted to highlight that. I think your paper really brought that out.
Nick, your exchange just now with Jason really kind of anticipated one of the questions that was from the audience, which was, really about America. I mean, sort of in the mirror image. I mean, are American China watchers like that? So I thank Arjun for that question, but we're going to move to one from Jocelyn Ford, a good friend, who asks, I mean, she apologizes for possibly having missed it, but actually this isn't something that you talked about. Was asking about the background of some of these scholars that you studied, whether they had worked overseas, and in which countries, if they had, what their foreign language capabilities, and if so, what languages, and what are the languages that they use for their research? Are they conducting research primarily in English, the language that dominates in America?
Yeah. So that's a great question. One that I didn't have time to delve into, but I didn't have time to discuss it, but certainly looked into it. So approximately, I believe, 2 of the scholars did PhDs or did sort of higher education in the United States. One of the scholars did a joint US-China master's program, the SAIS Nanjing program. Not sure if that was actually not sure if he actually studied in the US as part of that. And then the rest of them, a bunch of the other scholars have done visiting fellowships in the US, which I think is quite common, to spend a year at some US university or at some US think tank, and do that. You can do that multiple times if you want to. And so all of them have English to probably to varying degrees, but they all seem quite excellent to me. They probably all have better English than I have Chinese, to be honest, and probably better than most American scholars Chinese. So they have, and when I was looking, they frequently cite American language materials, or sorry, English language materials, but like, things from Congress, etc. So clearly have plenty of familiarity, knowledge, expertise. They have different backgrounds. Some of them are completely within academia. A couple, so Wang Wen has a different background. He worked as a journalist editor for the Global Times for a while. Zhao Minghao, he was actually at the Central International Liaison Department for a number of years before he came into academia. So mostly academic, a little bit different, and all have fairly extensive experience involving the U.S. Perhaps Su Xiaohui, who's currently at the Center of International Strategic, at the CIIS America Center has the least, but she is currently at the America Center for the Foreign Policy, for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs think tank.
All right, great. Jason, thanks. One super quick question from Dawe, who congratulates you on an excellent paper and asks basically what surprised you the most? What was something that popped out at you? And we'll leave it at that and then go to break.
Yeah. So I think for me personally, some of the things that were most surprising were I think one of the things that was most surprising is that a lot of these scholars viewed China as much more fragile or much more constrained than I expected. I think I was expecting much more confidence, much more, I guess, not necessarily bombast per se, but just, much more confidence and pride in China's future path, and confidence in the speed of China's ascent. And I think I was sort of just expecting that from a range of, from both like the existing American commentary, as well as from from what's going on in Chinese media, et cetera. But within these expert circles, at least, the views were very tempered, very sort of, I guess, yeah, we're very tempered, very moderate, and not especially extreme. And I just expected the I guess the mainstream opinion among these scholars to be much more, I wouldn't say aggressive, but much more, perhaps much more confident, I guess, in China.
All right, we have a motion to skip break and move directly now to Oliver Dieckmann. I think that's probably a good idea because we are just running right up against the time that we had intended to start that. So let's go ahead and do that. And if anyone does need to use the bathroom or anything, please feel free. But meanwhile, I'd like to invite Ollie to give his talk. It's fascinating. You know, he looks at the Yan'an period and looks at Sino-Soviet relations through the lens of the Short Course, which is a book that Stalin putatively authored, and the very multifaceted kind of interpretation that different CCP factions made of this, including most significantly Mao's. So with that, and then we'll have a couple of comments from me and from Natasha, and then audience questions. And Ollie, take it away. By the way, you know, thank you for all your great work with China Stories as intern.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you, Kaiser, for this warm introduction. And also thank you so much for an invitation to let me introduce my topic to you. So it is the reception of Stalin's short course among the CCP leadership before the Yan'an rectification campaign, 1939 and 1941. So let me kick off this presentation with a quote from Gao Hua, because this expresses what the following will be all about. It's about the power of interpretation. He wrote a massive and amazing work about Mao's rise to power, and he inspired me to this work. The power of interpretation, the power to define terminology, is one of the greatest powers available to human beings. Within the Communist Party of China, the power of interpretation was especially important. Whoever controlled the party's consciousness, sorry, I got out. Whoever was empowered to interpret the text of Marxism-Leninism controlled the party's consciousness. Okay, with that in mind, let's take a look onto Stalin's short course. Officially, it's the whole history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, and officially it was not written by Stalin himself, but from a central committee from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but later Stalin acknowledged that he wrote most of the most important parts of the work himself. It was seen in Russia as well as China and other countries from the socialist bloc, one of the most important books to spell out Marxist-Leninist theory, and was seen as one of and was by then, by the 50s, one of the most printed books in the world. And in it, Stalin and the co-authors rewrote a discourse on the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It was so from 1883 until 1937. In it, he stated that they didn't only win over capitalists in Russia or any kind of counter-revolutionaries, and not only won against foreign imperialists, but they especially won against inner party opponents, which were the history was spelled out as a series of line struggles, where Stalin represented, with Lenin as well, the correct line, political line, whereas his inner party opponents were represented as traitors, foreign spies, and so on, and were discredited by that. And in it, especially in the conclusion, which is the most important part of the book, I would say, he argues against dogmatism in a way that just as Lenin didn't follow 100% every the Capital and all the other works word by word. This is important so that people should not follow these dogmas blindly, but should renew and redevelop theory when it's important to do. Okay, let's come to terms with the Yan'an period and the CCP leadership by them. So we are in a context of a Chinese civil war going down against CCP, and the Yan'an period is after the long march in which the CCP escaped from Chiang Kai-shek's encirclement campaigns and had its main base, at least in Yan'an, Shanxi, as you see on the map. And in the background was the war against Japan going on. And this was, Yan'an is associated with the Yan'an rectification campaign, in which Mao established himself as the chief theoretician and fundamentally changed the way how ordinary and high-level party members and cadres understood ideology and how they thought. But the leadership wasn't unified at all by then. Already by the time of a study before 1942, Mao was seen as a military leader since the Sunni Conference and as a political leader, even acknowledged by Moscow. But he wasn't yet seen as the chief theoretician. He was seen that he would have not read as many books, especially as one faction or a big group from the Communist Party, which I would call for now the internationalists or pro-Soviets. So they all studied at the Sun Yat-sen University in Moscow. They were part of a communist international and thereby stood under guidance of Moscow and of Stalin, of a communist international. And their claim to power, the reason how they rose to power was that they studied and mastered the theory and thereby could guide the party ideologically, which Mao was firstly seen as not being that much able to do. He was rather, as I said, a military leader, and ideologically he and his political allies stood for a rather Chinese way of socialism, meaning to adapt all the class or all the Marxist-Leninist ideas to Chinese realities. Okay, since we came to terms with that, I will introduce my research question, which is how the CCP leadership reacted to Stalin's short course before the Yan'an rectification campaign. And I found out that both sides actually have praised Stalin's short course, and both try to apply it for their own political purposes. However, differently, these internationalists found in it rather, they seek a rather direct application of some universal laws of the Marxist-Leninist science in the short course, whereas Mao and his political allies saw in it an inspiration for Chinese Marxism, and I will spell all of this out more in detail how they instrumentalized onto that book, but they wanted to use it especially for the Chinese realities. On this point, I want to credit once more Gao Hua with his book How the Red Sun Rose, because this argument is basically taken and inspired from a chapter about seizing ideological control. However, he only let Mao himself speak about the short course and what he thought about it. And it would have helped support his very own argument to let other people from his faction and from internationalists speak. It opens up this the spectrum and gives even an even broader view about disagreements and what people make out of history and their narratives. So the methodology is pretty straightforward. I compare comments from internationalists and from Mao and his allies about it. And from Mao, I picked a very famous text, Reform Our Studies, a key text from the rectification campaign, and a not so well-known text from Chen Yun, Studying is the Duty of CCP Members. And from Kai Feng, who I think represents the internationalist side, I will represent the following texts, which is the historical and international meaning of the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So Kai Feng was clearly on the internationalist side, but still supporting Mao as a military leader. He was the deputy director of the propaganda department, and yeah, thereby I think that he represents this the view of also his fellows, I think, from an internationalist side of the Communist Party. I talk this with the article I analyzed from the Liberation Weekly from 1939, so after. And the Liberation Weekly was seen as the official mouthpiece of the leadership from the of the Central Committee from the CCP. What did he say? He said that a short course is an encyclopedia of Marxism-Leninism. This implies that it solves all the basic theoretical questions in the political work. And in 50% of his article, he quoted a resolution and reproduced and agreed to a resolution, a propaganda resolution from the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which also stated that it's meant to the short course helps to root out inner party enemies, that especially those who deliberately would be twisting up any Marxism in a wrong and evil way, and yeah, to solve any theoretical questions, as he said himself. Then interestingly, he used many times a word to master Bolshevism. It's Jingtong. Jingtong Bolshevism, he said many times, and Jingtong is something as one can, it means to master in English, and it's can be understood as to master a foreign language or any academic subject. And this basically also shows his understanding to apply these laws at Chinese to apply these laws in China. And as the title says, it has also an international meaning and historical meaning. So he found a confidence in the war against Japan, and it should be seen as the norm to achieve communism all over the world. And lastly, he said that the short course is also meant as a moving compass and shouldn't be seen as a dogma. So even he and his side said so himself, but thereby one should say he quoted Stalin, who also said this pretty clearly, and he stated he quoted Stalin when he explained that. Okay, let's move to the Mao side. First, I would like to introduce a speech from Chen Yun, who became later known for his economic policies in the PRC. But by 1959, he was the head of our organizational department in the CCP, was responsible for cadre examination, and was thereby playing a very important role within the rectification campaign. And he switched sides from internationalists to Mao in 1938. And by then, Mao called high-level cadres to study Marxism, but under Chinese realities, in combination with the Chinese realities. And yes, he urged by then already cadres to study the short course. And this is where Chen Yun performed and held a high-level speech to high-level cadres about studying theory, which must definitely be connected to the practice. And let me read out this quote. For example, everyone read Lenin's sentence, without revolutionary theory, there can't be a revolutionary movement. And we took this to understand that studying theories is important. However, after reading the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, especially after reading its concluding words, one realizes that this sentence of Lenin yet has another meaning. And the only reference, the only point in the conclusion about which he can mean is this point against dogmatism, to adapt this and to redevelop the theory. Mao said something pretty similar. He did so slightly later. Here's a speech. It was the speech in 1949 for the which was already part of the which was meant for the rectification campaign. That Mao launched an attack against, especially against what he called dogmatists, so people who blindly followed the rules and guidance and dogmas from the Soviet Union or from any books. And he wanted to change this working style when he held this speech. He said, "We should use the short course as the principal material. It is the best synthesis and summing up of the world communist movement of the past 100 years. A model of the integration of theory and practice, and so far the only comprehensive model in the whole world. When we see how Lenin and Stalin integrated the universal truth of Marxism with the concrete practice of the Soviet revolution and thereby developed Marxism, we shall know how we should work in China. And thereby he indirectly states that these Soviet leaders who were reading so many books were not needed because he undermined this legitimacy why they're in power, because as he says, what's more needed is to understand these Chinese these Chinese realities in combination with Marxism and indirectly with him as the main interpreter who understands theory in China the best. And this isn't only a strike against these pro-Soviets or internationalists within the CCP, but also promotes emancipation from the control of Moscow. So if we compare this, we see that Kaifeng spoke rather of the mastery of Bolshevism, which neither Mao nor Chen said, and Mao and Chen rather praised or definitely praised the unity of theory and practice. And they saw, and they, as they understood it through, especially how Mao understood it through this, through seeing it, through studying this history, one can understand, and it shows very clearly what should be done in China. Whereas again, Kaifeng saw in it dialectical laws which could be rather applied rather like that. And importantly, then Mao saw in it in emancipation, the move against Russia's control. And Kaifeng and from internationalists even quoted directly the resolution from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union what to think about the short course, whereby they haven't been seeking for emancipation from Russia's control. And both saw in it as Marxism not as a dogma, but I would only really buy it from Mao, from the side of Mao. And importantly, both instrumentalized this short course and for their own political purposes. And Mao did so, and he found thereby a weapon from to beat his inner party opponents with their own weapons, Stalin's guidance and ideology. Okay, that's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I'm curious about the questions.
Well, thank you, Ali. That was fascinating, and it's really interesting to me. I think that it's a clever judo move on the part of Mao, and one that I can see would be very persuasive to a lot of people. It's sort of see how Comrade Stalin shows the way that Marxism must be adapted to, must be implemented in accordance with local conditions. It's a very clever way to at once distance himself from Moscow's influence and to sort of flank the internationalist wing within the CCP at the same time still demonstrating fealty to Stalin and to Stalinism. So I think it's quite brilliant, and it's a very interesting. I think it's an important way to understand Mao's actual rise within the CCP in the Yan'an period, and this the way that he addressed this very important early struggle prior to the rectification campaign. So really important contribution there, and I thank you. I don't really have that much by way of questions, so let me pass on directly then to Natasha, or I think it was Nick that you were gonna.
This is Natasha, but yeah,
Natasha, right, Natasha on this one, right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Oliver. Another absolutely fascinating presentation for today. And as someone who read history as an undergrad, I always find studies that bridge kind of this politics and history particularly fascinating. You took 3 differing historical sources to showcase kind of different responses to the same event, which is always an interesting thing to do. Mm-hmm. Your question was looking at how did the CCP leadership react to Stalin's short course before the Yan'an rectification campaign. I'm just wondering more generally, how did the CCP leadership react to Stalin's short course after the Yan'an rectification campaign? And that is to say, did it change in the immediate events following the Yan'an rectification campaign from like the Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s, so more external factors, to more internal, such as the rise of the Cultural Revolution?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, and thank you for your comments, Kaiser and Natasha. So afterwards, during and after the rectification campaign, this short course has been taken as a study material, which influenced the thinking very much of creators. It was in the 60s that the short course has been exchanged by the selected works of Mao, whereas so it was taught in the PRC for a longer time than it was taught in Russia, for example, given the de-Stalinization. And yes, that's a great paper which wrote for you, Lee. And it's, I think the name is instilling Stalinism into the CCP members, which gave many, which interviewed many people, which interviewed many students of a short course who believed everything, and it was they saw it as, maybe it's a big word, but maybe as a holy scripture, or that this is the book in which all the truth stands inside. And it came just after the Cultural Revolution that these doubts were rising about the content of the book.
Fascinating. Thanks so much, Oliver. I think Nick also had a question to ask as well.
Yeah, if that's all right. This was really fascinating, and I always enjoy kind of close readings of texts, and really taking text seriously, because I think, at least within the current discourse of political science, we treat texts kind of as objects, but we don't really think critically about how they're being received. And I really commend this effort and want to emphasize that I think it's super, super important. So my question is a little bit out of the scope of the time period you're dealing with. But my sense is that within a decade, all of this would come crumbling down with the Sino-Soviet split. And scholars of international security kind of tend to look at structural and material factors that relate to the deteriorating Chinese-Soviet relationship. A lot of this, we try to think of it as sort of self-interest and balance, but it's obvious that there's also a pretty severe ideological component to this, right, as well. I'm not a specialist in inter-party history, but I'm wondering whether or not your really close readings of these texts and how they morph and change as they're received in some ways foreshadows or presages, a potential ideological split that could be a real kind of challenge to the conventional arguments, that most security studies scholars might have about, why that relationship fractured.
Thank you for the question, Nick. I would rather think that given that that since the secret speech of Khrushchev in 1956, the CCP leadership saw themselves rather endangered by the de-Stalinization, and they wanted basically to rather still find like ideological orientation from it and still rather learn from it. I couldn't see any signs of disagreements which in that way before that war.
Interesting. Do you think that we can connect any of the power struggles that your paper articulates over who controls the official party theoretical narrative, the interpretation on the narrative of history, to Xi Jinping thought today? Are you seeing, is there a piece of text or a body of thought that is sort of subject to the same level of kind of discursive battle that we saw in Yan'an over the short course? It's kind of a reach, but
well, I would rather say that to make a link for today, I would rather say that generally this style, well, it was after the Long March that Mao already said that we will talk and give a narrative about the Long March as a great victory. And I think this has since then proceeded in a sense to use the past to serve the present. And we can definitely still see this. And I would rather say that to understand how party historiography is written today, I would just generally point out to a short course that I think that it still plays a lot of inspiration, that it still gives inspiration to the party leadership in a sense to to instrumentalize it, to find a to find clear political purpose to write party history. And it was rather than that Mao Zedong used and was inspired by the short course in 1945 when he wrote the resolution on party history. That year.
I want to thank you, Ali. That this was fantastic, and you've done me proud as your former employer when you were. So I'm really grateful to you, and for all of these papers. I mean, this was just. I feel like I've just been drinking out of a fire hose all week, just taking in the fantastic work that you've done, and it's what a great job that Natasha and Nick have done in selecting these papers. I think all of them connect in different and very interesting ways to the theme of our conference today on history and memory, and the way that the usages to which historical memory is put in these different contexts. So I think that was an extremely well-chosen theme, extremely well-chosen papers. I would love to follow up with several or all of you about getting you onto Sinica and diving into your work in more depth. I'm also really encouraged that in Nick and Natasha, just seeing that at some point I can hand off this whole Sinica thing when I get old and retire. I have two people waiting in the wings who could do a fabulous job with it. So I want to turn to Natasha and to Nick and to see if they have any final thoughts on this, and to share some of their experiences, what they've learned in organizing this. And I want to hear their enthusiastic commitments to doing this again next year, if not sooner, because this I think was a fantastic exercise, and I really had a great time with it. And I'm super honored that we could work together with such talents as you guys, and that you asked me to sit in as discussant for this whole session.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kaiser. It's been such an exciting conference today with such a diverse pool, like you said, of papers, but all connected through this kind of analysis into history and memory, which, as we all know here today, is becoming more and more important with time, not just in China, but in states all over the world. So first and foremost, thank you so much to all the presenters today. Fantastic job from all of you. And we can see, this has taken you a lot of time to prepare, and just showcasing your work to all of us today. Really, thank you so much. And thank you so much to Nick as well for helping and, making this happen. We thought of this about a year ago, and it's so great to see it happening here today. And big thanks to Kaiser as well for obviously moderating and hosting today too. Nick, I'm not sure if you wanted to say any words. But...
Yeah, no, I mean, you said it all so wonderfully. I also want to give a huge thank you to the SupChina admin team. So Isaac Apple, Stella Tsai, who were really instrumental in helping us get this off the ground. And also the former head of business development, Alex Urist. None of this would have been possible unless they took an enormous leap of faith with us. When Natasha and I had this idea, we were sitting in a coffee shop on a rainy day in Zhongshan in the middle of Taipei during the midst of the pandemic, and we were working as volunteer student ambassadors for SupChina. And we had this idea of trying to take active steps to really push SupChina's mission forward of not only providing, top quality journalism, but also meaningfully engaging with new and exciting work in the field to try and bridge the gap between academia and scholarship. And, my own personal sense is that I think that gap has been narrowing over the past few years. And I think that's really, really important not to be pessimistic about that future. But at a time when US-China relations are so uncertain, again, we return to this theme of the security dilemma. I think these kinds of exchanges are more important than they have ever been. And I thank all of our listeners for participating, all of our fabulous speakers for taking the time to be with us. You guys are all part of this active movement, to protect knowledge and to make sure that we put ourselves on the best foot going forward for the future. So with that, thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.
Excellent. All right.
All right.